There is a 3-mile stretch of open water between the islands of Saipan and Tinian, and on a clear day, you can stand on the southern shore of Saipan and see Tinian's flat green outline sitting on the horizon like a table set for something terrible. That view hasn't changed much in 80 years. The water is still the same shade of deep Pacific blue. The island still looks, from that distance, like nothing much at all. 40 square miles of coral and limestone, a handful of hills, some scrub vegetation, and, if you look carefully, the faint grey geometry of broken runways cutting across the plateau in the north. That's it. That's the whole picture. And if you didn't know what happened here, if nobody had ever told you, you would sail right past it and never give it a second thought. I need you to understand something before we go any further. The island you are looking at launched the atomic age. Not metaphorically, not approximately, literally. On the 6th of August, 1945, an aircraft lifted off from a runway on Tinian's northern plateau and flew northwest for 6 hours. And what it dropped on the city of Hiroshima killed somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 people in a single moment. A number so large and so sudden that the human mind still struggles to process it as real. 3 days later, a second aircraft left the same island and flew to Nagasaki. Between those two missions and the conventional firebombing campaign that preceded them, also launched from Tinian, somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 Japanese civilians died. The physical starting point for all of it was a runway on a sugarcane island that most people alive today have never heard of. That fact alone should be enough to hold your attention for the next several hours. But I promise you the story is more complicated and more human, and in some ways more devastating than even that beginning suggests. Here is what this documentary is not. It is not a celebration of the atomic bomb. It is not a military recruitment advertisement dressed up as history. It is not a compression of a complex event into a clean moral fable, where the good people win and the bad people lose, and everyone learns something useful and goes home. I've been making documentaries and researching military history for long enough to have grown genuinely tired of all three of those things. And I made a deliberate decision when I started working on Tinian that I was going to resist every one of those temptations, even when they would have made the narration easier or the runtime shorter. What this documentary is, instead, is the fullest account I can assemble of everything that happened on and around a specific piece of Pacific real estate between roughly December of 1943 and August of 1945, and of what that geography has meant to the people who have lived on it, fought on it, built on it, and remembered it in the 8 decades since. That includes the strategic planning debates in American conference rooms, the Japanese garrison commander who built his defense around a logical assumption that turned out to be wrong, the Marine general and the naval admiral who nearly came to blows over the width of 2 beaches, the Seabees, civilian tradesmen handed rifles and told to build the largest airfield complex in the world in 9 months, who did exactly that in the Pacific tropics, directly behind an active combat front. The scientists who assembled weapons of unprecedented destructive power in reinforced concrete buildings on a former sugarcane plantation. The pilots who flew the missions, and the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki whose experience of what departed from Tinian's runways is the final and most morally heavy chapter of this entire story. Let me tell you about the geography, because the geography explains everything. And it's where every serious account of Tinian has to begin. The Mariana Islands form a chain of volcanic and limestone islands running roughly north to south in the western Pacific, approximately 1,400 miles southeast of Tokyo. Saipan is the largest, Guam is further south, and Tinian sits between them, 3 miles southwest of Saipan. separated from its larger neighbour by a channel that, on a calm day, looks barely wider than a decent river crossing. What made Tinian remarkable was not its size, or its population, or its natural resources. What made Tinian remarkable was its flatness. In an ocean full of rugged, mountainous, jungle-covered islands where building anything level larger than a tennis court requires engineering heroism, Tinian was almost perfectly horizontal. Its highest point was Mount Lasso, at roughly 564 feet in the island's north. The rest of the island was a flat limestone plateau covered in sugarcane. Square field after square field of it, separated by drainage ditches and windbreaks, so that from the air the island looked like a giant green chessboard. Under the Japanese colonial administration that had run the island since 1922, that flatness had produced sugar. Under the American military administration that arrived in July of 1944, that same flatness produced runways, and runways in 1944 changed the geometry of the entire Pacific War. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the aircraft that Tinian's runways were built to accommodate, had a combat range of roughly 3,300 miles. From the Marianas, that range reached Tokyo. From anywhere else the Americans held in the summer of 1944, it didn't. That arithmetic, brutal, simple, inescapable, was why the Marianas were a strategic objective of the First Order. It was why the United States committed 2 Marine divisions, 1 Army division, a fleet of warships, and more than 100,000 men to the operation code-named Forager, which took Saipan in July of 1944, then Tinian, then Guam. Whoever held those 3 islands held the key to the strategic air campaign against Japan. And the strategic air campaign against Japan was, by the summer of 1944, the path that American planners had chosen to end the war without the catastrophic cost of a land invasion of the Japanese home islands. Tinian was the hinge on which that entire calculation turned. I want to introduce you to the central cast of this story, because history is made by people and not by geography. And the men and women who shaped what happened on Tinian deserve to be seen as individuals before they become players in a larger narrative. There is Colonel Kiyoshi Ogata, the Japanese army officer who commanded Tinian's garrison and who built a careful, logical defense around a reasonable military assumption that turned out to be completely wrong. His story is a study in the cruel efficiency with which warfare punishes correct reasoning about the wrong problem. There is Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, Terrible Turner, to the sailors who served under him, who controlled the Amphibious forces, and who fought loudly and persistently and ultimately unsuccessfully for a landing plan that the Marine ground commanders believed would have been catastrophically costly. There is Lieutenant General Holland Howlin' Mad Smith, whose nickname was not accidental, who refused to accept Turner's plan, and whose professional stubbornness almost certainly saved a large number of Marine lives. There is Major James L. Jones, whose reconnaissance battalion paddled rubber boats in the dark to within swimming distance of Tinian's north coast, and confirmed that the beaches nobody wanted to use were, in fact, the beaches that would win the battle. There is Captain William Parsons, who armed the first atomic bomb in an unpressurized bomb bay at altitude over the Pacific because he was afraid of what a runway crash with a live weapon would produce. And there is Colonel Paul Tibbets, who flew the Enola Gay, who never expressed public regret, who asked for no funeral and no tombstone, and whose name is permanently attached to the most consequential single military mission in history, regardless of how anyone chooses to evaluate it. These are not simple people. None of them fit cleanly into the categories that popular history tends to assign to the participants in large events. They made decisions under conditions of genuine uncertainty, with incomplete information, within institutional and cultural frameworks that shaped what options were even visible to them. Understanding what they did requires understanding the world they were operating in, not judging them by standards that didn't exist yet, but not exempting them from moral scrutiny simply because the standards were different then. That is the balance I'm trying to hold throughout this documentary. I don't always succeed perfectly, but I'm trying. There is something else I want to say before we start. Something about the people who tend not to appear in documentaries about the Battle of Tinian because their absence is itself a historical fact worth naming. The indigenous Chamorro people of the Mariana Islands had been living on Tinian long before anyone else in this story arrived. The Spanish came first, colonizing the Marianas from the 17th century onward, converting and reshaping the Chamorro population in ways from which it has never fully recovered. Then the Germans, briefly, then the Japanese, who removed the Chamorro population from Tinian entirely to use the island as an agricultural colony. The Chamorro people of Tinian were not on their own island when the battle was fought. They had been displaced before the war began. When the battle ended and the American military moved in, they were eventually permitted to return to an island that had been transformed beyond recognition, its surface covered in runways and Quonset huts and fuel dumps and bomb assembly buildings, its soil compressed by millions of tons of construction equipment, its caves and cliffs still holding the dead of a battle that had been conducted entirely by other people, on Chamorro land, for reasons that had nothing to do with the Chamorro people and everything to do with the strategic ambitions of two industrialized powers. Their story is the oldest story on this island, and the one most consistently left out of the standard account. I'm going to try to include it. The Okinawan laborers who had been brought to Tinian before the war to work in the sugarcane fields. Contract workers, many of them effectively indentured, whose families had followed them to a foreign island in the Western Pacific, were present on Tinian when the battle was fought. They were not Japanese soldiers. They were not Japanese colonial administrators. They were working people caught inside a military catastrophe that was none of their making, on an island that was not their home, with nowhere to go when the shooting started. Thousands of them survived. Some did not. Their experience of the battle has been documented in Okinawan oral history projects and local historical research that the standard English language military narrative has largely failed to incorporate. I'm not going to fail to incorporate it. This documentary is 15 chapters long. It runs several hours. I made a deliberate decision not to cut it down, and I want to explain that decision directly, rather than just presenting you with the length as a fait accompli. The Battle of Tinian has a before and an after that are both, in their own right, as historically significant as the 9 days of fighting that most accounts spend the majority of their time on. The before, the strategic planning, the intelligence work, the reconnaissance, the naval bombardment program, the logistical operation that positioned 2 Marine divisions on an island 3 miles away and then launched them across open water, is where the battle was actually decided, and it requires real time to understand properly. The after, the construction of Northfield, the arrival of the 509th Composite Group, the Manhattan Project's westernmost outpost operating behind a fence on a former sugarcane plantation, the missions of August 1945, and the 8 decades of memory and moral argument that have followed, is where the battle's consequences live. And those consequences are still with us, right now, today, in the nuclear deterrence frameworks and arms control debates and the living testimonies of the last surviving Hibakusha. None of that can be honored in 90 minutes, so I didn't try. What I've tried to do instead is give you the full account at the pace the material deserves, with the research visible and the gaps acknowledged, and the uncomfortable questions asked rather than avoided. There are moments in this documentary where I don't know the answer to a question, and I say so. There are moments where the historical record is contested, and I present the contest rather than picking a winner. There are moments where the moral weight of what happened on this island presses against the narrative frame of a military history documentary in ways that I think the audience deserves to feel, rather than having smoothed away for comfort. If that's what you came here for, genuine engagement with a genuinely complex piece of history, then I think you're in the right place. If you came here for 80 minutes of inspiring wartime highlight reel, I understand. But this isn't that. And I think if you give it time, you'll find that what this is instead is more interesting. One more thing, and then we start. I've read everything I could find: the Marine Corps historical monographs, the after-action reports in the National Archives, the intelligence interrogation summaries of Japanese prisoners, the personal accounts of Seabees who drove bulldozers across coral runways in the August heat, the oral histories of B-29 crew members who flew 14-hour missions over the Pacific and came home with things behind their eyes that they didn't talk about until they were old. The testimony of Hibakusha, whose accounts of the morning of the 6th of August, 1945, are preserved in archives in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Chamorro cultural histories maintained by the Northern Marianas community. The post-war memoirs of American commanders who spent the rest of their lives with Tinian on their records and the atomic missions in the air around their names. I did not make anything up. Every date, every unit designation, every casualty figure, every quoted word in this documentary comes from a named, attributable source. Where the sources disagree, I tell you they disagree. Where the record has gaps, I tell you the record has gaps. I believe that is the minimum standard for anyone who asks an audience to spend several hours with them on a subject this serious. And Tinian is serious as any place on the map. So, let's begin. Chapter 1 starts with a question about geography and a strategic decision made in December of 1943 that most people have never heard of. By the time we're done with it, you'll understand why a planning meeting in Cairo set in motion a chain of events that ended above a Japanese city 14 months later, and you'll never look at a flat piece of land the same way again. If this is the kind of history you want more of, documented, unfiltered, and long enough to do the subject justice, hit subscribe. Leave a comment below telling me what you already know about Tinian, what surprised you, or what you think I've gotten wrong. I read every comment, and I take them seriously. The best history is a conversation, and I want to have it with you. Now, let's go to the island. Chapter 1. The island at the center of the world. Let me tell you something that the standard narrative about the Pacific War tends to skip over too quickly. The decision to go after the Mariana Islands, and Tinian specifically, wasn't inevitable. It was a choice made by specific people at specific moments in the face of serious disagreement. History has a way of making the path that was taken look like the only path that ever existed, and that's almost always wrong. Understanding why the Americans went to Tinian, why they wanted it so badly, and why they couldn't simply go around it. That's where this story actually begins. The Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Rota, and a scattering of smaller islands, form a chain running roughly north to south in the Western Pacific, about 1,400 miles southeast of Tokyo. They had been Spanish territory for centuries, passed to Germany after the Spanish-American War, then occupied by Japan during the First World War, and formally awarded to Japan under a League of Nations mandate in 1922. Under the Japanese South Seas Mandate, Tinian was developed heavily, mostly by the South Seas Development Company, the Nanyo Kohatsu Kaisha, as an agricultural operation. The sugarcane industry was the island's economy. By the beginning of 1944, the island held approximately 18,000 Japanese civilians and a garrison that was growing as Tokyo began to appreciate the strategic exposure the Marianas represented. The American military had been thinking about the Marianas since before the war. During the 1920s and 30s, war planners working on the so-called Orange Plans, the contingency blueprints for a Pacific conflict with Japan, had mostly focused on a drive through the Marshall and Caroline Islands toward the Philippines. The Marianas sat slightly north of that route and weren't central to the original thinking. What changed everything was technology, specifically the development of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. I want to spend a moment on this because it's the thread that connects a sugarcane island to the atomic age. The B-29 had a pressurized cabin, allowing it to operate above 25,000 feet, well above the effective range of most anti-aircraft guns, and a combat range of roughly 3,300 miles. That range, crucially, put the Japanese home islands within reach from the Marianas. From Saipan, Tinian, or Guam, a B-29 could fly to Tokyo, drop its load, and return. Admiral Ernest King, the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, said it plainly at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943. The Marianas were, in his phrase, the key to the situation because of their location on the Japanese line of communications. If you held the Marianas, you could strangle Japan from the air. At the Cairo Conference in December 1943, the combined chiefs of staff endorsed the two-pronged Pacific offensive and locked the Marianas into the plan. The operation was called Forager. Saipan would come first, then Tinian, then Guam. On the 12th of March, 1944, Admiral Chester Nimitz received his formal directive: neutralize Truk and occupy the Marianas. Tinian's flat terrain was extraordinary by Pacific Island standards. Saipan was mountainous and complicated. Guam was larger but rugged. Tinian was almost perfectly level, a natural airfield waiting to be built. There were already 4 Japanese airstrips on the island in various stages of completion. Ushi Point Airfield in the north, designated Airfield Number 1 by American planners, had a hard surfaced runway nearly 4,800 feet long. American intelligence, drawing on aerial photography, ultra signals, intercepts, and documents captured when the Japanese 31st Army headquarters on Saipan was overrun in mid-June, estimated the garrison at roughly 8,000 men, a figure that proved remarkably accurate. I want to make one more observation before we move on, because it tends to get lost in the tactical details that follow. The decision to seize the Marianas was made at a conference table in December 1943, and the men who made it were thinking primarily about B-29 bases. They weren't thinking about atomic bombs. That program was still deeply classified, still uncertain, still a project running in parallel that very few of the Forager planners knew anything about. What they were constructing was a platform for strategic bombing. The fact that it would eventually become something vastly more consequential is one of history's more unsettling facts, or perhaps not a coincidence at all. Perhaps that's just how industrial warfare works. You build the infrastructure first, and the weapons find their purpose later. Chapter 2. The Garrison. On the chessboard, Colonel Kiyoshi Ogata arrived on Tinian in March of 1944 as the commanding officer of the 50th Infantry Regiment, a unit with its roots in Manchuria and experience hardened in the war in China. The 50th was part of the 29th Division, the rest of which was on Guam. Ogata had roughly 5,000 army troops under his direct command, 3 infantry battalions, a mountain artillery battalion with 12 75mm guns, an anti-tank company with 6 37mm anti-tank guns, and a company of 12 light tanks drawn from the 18th Infantry Regiment. In addition to his army force, There were approximately 4,000 Imperial Japanese Navy personnel on the island. The main naval fighting unit, the 56th Naval Guard Force, under Captain Goichi Oi, contributed about 1,400 fighting troops equipped with coast defense guns and anti-aircraft batteries. Oye accepted Ogata's overall authority, but he did not inform his own subordinates that their orders originated from an army officer, apparently to avoid embarrassment about the chain of command. I find that detail genuinely illuminating about the bureaucratic dysfunction of late-war Japanese command arrangements. There was also a higher-ranking Japanese officer on the island who had no formal authority over any of it. Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuta, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, had been on an inspection tour when American aerial operations began on the 11th of June and became cut off. He was trapped on Tinian with no fleet, no aircraft worth speaking of, and no command authority over the defending troops. He sent messages. He gave opinions. The actual defense was Ogata's responsibility. Ogata's defense plan followed orthodox Japanese doctrine: concentrate forces at the most accessible landing sites and destroy the enemy on the beaches. The southwest coast around Sunharan Bay offered the best beaches. Blue Beach, roughly 600 yards long. Green Beaches 1 and 2 around Tinian town. Red and orange beaches to the north. And Ogata positioned his heaviest forces there. The north coast's 2 small beaches, White Beach 1 at 60 to 75 yards wide, and White Beach 2 at roughly 200 yards wide, were assigned only a single company. Conventional amphibious doctrine required a landing beach of at least 1,000 yards. Ogata was reasoning correctly from that doctrine when he wrote the northern beaches off. His mobile counterattack force, the 1st Battalion of the 135th Infantry under Captain Bunzo Izumi, with 12 light tanks, was positioned centrally to reach either coast once the American landing direction became clear. It was a logical plan, professionally arranged, perfectly suited to fight the Americans Ogata expected. Unfortunately for him, the Americans who arrived were planning something significantly different. I always pause at this point in the story, because there's something quietly devastating about Ogata's position. He was a professional, commanding, experienced men, many of them veterans of years of fighting in China. He knew the Americans were coming. Saipan had fallen on the 9th of July, and the sound of that battle had been audible on Tinian for weeks. He had no hope of reinforcement. He had no meaningful air support. On the 25th of June, he issued an operational order estimating that the Americans would land either at Tinian Town Harbour or at Asiga Bay on the northeast coast. He was wrong about the location, and by the time he found out, it would be too late. Chapter 3. The argument that nearly killed the plan. I want to spend some real time on what happened at a meeting aboard USS Rocky Mount in early July of 1944, because it's one of those moments where the outcome of a battle was almost decided, not by the enemy, but by an argument between allies. The argument was between Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, who commanded the Joint Expeditionary Force, and Lieutenant General Holland M. Howlin' Mad Smith, who commanded the expeditionary troops. Their disagreement was about where the Marines should land on Tinian, and if Turner had won it, the operation might have gone catastrophically wrong. Turner's position was straightforward. Land at Tinian Town. The southwestern beaches had good gradients, a protected harbour, and facilities for supply. The northern beaches were too small and couldn't support a 2-division landing under any reading of standard doctrine. Rear Admiral Harry Hill later wrote that Turner simply would not listen, and again ordered me in very positive terms to stop all White Beach planning. Turner's nickname, Terrible Turner, wasn't accidental. He was a driven, difficult, demanding officer who combined genuine brilliance with a temperament that left scorched earth behind him in conference rooms. Smith's position was equally clear. Landing at Tinian town would be another Tarawa. Ogata had concentrated his best troops, coast defense guns, and anti-tank weapons on those southwestern beaches. Exactly the battle the Japanese had prepared and trained to fight. If we go ashore at Tinian town, Smith told Turner, in words he recorded in his memoir, we'll have another Tarawa. Sure as hell, the Japs will murder us. Tarawa had cost more than 1,000 American dead in roughly 76 hours, and its memory sat heavily on every Marine general who planned an amphibious operation in the Pacific. The exchange that followed has become one of the more colourful episodes in the Pacific War's backstage history. Turner roared, "Holland, you are not going to land on the White Beaches. I won't land you there." Smith recorded his reply. "Oh, yes, you will. You'll land me any goddamned place I tell you to. I'm the one who makes the tactical plans around here." At one point, Turner reportedly questioned whether the reconnaissance teams knew what to look for, calling them just a bunch of Marines. Smith shot back that he'd take it all the way to Spruance and Nimitz if necessary. The argument went on for hours. What broke the deadlock was the work of Major James L. Jones and his V Amphibious Corps, Amphibious Reconnaissance Battalion, together with underwater demolition teams 5 and 7, on the night of the 10th and 11th of July. Their rubber boats, 10-man black neoprene inflatables, were towed to within 1,500 yards of the shore and then paddled to 500 yards, at which point the swimmers entered the water with nothing but a knife, a CO2 life belt, a flashlight, and a packet of Aviator's yellow dye. The Yellow Beach reconnaissance on the east coast confirmed that those beaches were strung with double-apron wire and flanked by unscalable 25-foot cliffs. Lieutenant Donald Neff crawled through Japanese wire to 30 yards inland, while Japanese work crews moved nearby and sentries swept flashlights across the sand. He was not detected. He was awarded the Silver Star. The White Beach reconnaissance ran into tidal current trouble. Teams were swept off course. One group spent hours treading water in the Saipan Channel after missing the recovery boats. But the second night reconnaissance of White Beach 2 confirmed everything Schmidt's staff had hoped. Captain Silverthorne's briefing to Rear Admiral Hill was concise. "Admiral, the beaches are narrow. There are no mines, no coral heads, no boulders, no wire, no boat obstacles, and no offshore reefs. The beaches are as flat as a billiard table." Hill responded, "You have convinced me." At the formal conference on the 12th of July, Admiral Spruance called a vote in order of seniority. Watson, Schmidt, Hill, and Smith voted for the White Beaches. Turner, to the surprise of the room, agreed to make it unanimous. Chapter 4. Iron Rain, the Bombardment of Tinian. The bombardment of Tinian was not an event that began on J-Day. It was a process that had been running for 5 weeks before a single Marine came ashore. The Exiv Corps artillery on Saipan began shelling Tinian on the 20th of June, even before the Battle of Saipan had officially concluded. Battery B of the 531st Field Artillery Battalion opened fire with its 155mm long tom guns. Over the weeks that followed, the artillery conducted more than 1,500 counter-battery, harassing, and area bombardment missions, expending 24,536 rounds. 9 light observation aircraft, Piper Elfau Grasshoppers based at Aslito Field, flew daily spotting missions over Tinian throughout this period. The naval bombardment commenced on the 13th of June. Through late June and into July, the program was systematic and methodical. On the 25th of June, destroyer escort USS Eldon and destroyer USS Bancroft detected Japanese barges attempting to leave Sunharan Harbor and destroyed them. The cruisers USS Indianapolis, Birmingham, and Montpelier conducted a week of concentrated attacks, beginning on the 26th of June. Nothing was getting in or out of Tinian. On the 23rd of July, the day before the landing, the peak bombardment began. 3 battleships, 5 cruisers, and 16 destroyers participated. The battleship USS Colorado fired 60 16-inch shells at the concealed 340mm coast defense guns at Fiber San Hilo Point and completely destroyed the position. USS Tennessee and USS California, both damaged at Pearl Harbor and now returned modernized, fired 480 14-inch and 805-inch rounds into Tinian town, reducing it to rubble. The air campaign ran alongside the naval guns. Aircraft from USS Essex and USS Langley flew at least 200 sorties. Army Air Force P-47 Thunderbolts of the 318th Fighter Group flew more than 100 additional sorties. The first operational use of napalm in combat occurred during this bombardment. White phosphorus attempts on the 18th and 19th of July to burn Tinian's vegetation had failed because the foliage was too wet. 18 napalm sorties were flown instead. Results were described as inconclusive. The optimal fuel mixture hadn't been worked out yet, but cane fields did catch fire in several areas. It's a detail that sits uneasily, and deliberately so. Here, for the first time, the weapon that would be used across Japan in the firebombing campaigns of 1945 was being refined on the island that would eventually launch those very campaigns. On J-Day itself, more than 350 Navy and Army aircraft dropped 500 bombs, 200 rockets, 42 incendiary clusters, and 34 napalm bombs. The hardest hit target was, deliberately, not the white beaches. It was Tinian town, which the Americans intended to hit hard enough to convince Ogata the feint was real. When the Colorado and the destroyer Norman Scott were struck by the concealed Japanese guns during the covering fire for the diversionary feint, Colorado hit 22 times, killing 43 and wounding 198. Norman Scott losing her captain and 18 crew. The price for that deception was paid in American blood. But the feint held. One prisoner taken after the battle, asked about the effect of the pre-landing bombardment, said the experience had been almost unbearable. That phrase appears in the official Marine Corps historical account. I've thought about it often. A man who fought to the last on an island he knew was lost, who waited for an assault he couldn't precisely predict, and the word he chose, in the end, was almost. There's a kind of terrible endurance in that word that the ordnance statistics alone don't capture. Chapter 5. In the Water Before Dawn. The reconnaissance I want to slow down considerably for this chapter. The reconnaissance of Tinian's beaches is, in my view, one of the most underappreciated episodes in the entire Pacific War. Nobody is being photographed charging across open ground. The action happens in darkness, in silence, in cold water, conducted by men whose job is specifically to not be seen and not be heard. But what they found or didn't find on those 2 small northern beaches decided the fate of the entire operation. The V Amphibious Corps Amphibious Reconnaissance Battalion had been formally constituted as a 2-company battalion only on the 14th of April, 1944, barely 3 months before the Tinian landings. Major James L. Jones commanded it. The unit's institutional knowledge was recent, its tactics still being developed in real time, and its equipment improvised from available components. The rubber landing craft were painted black. Communications were limited. Navigation at night in tidal waters was genuinely difficult. These were not the sophisticated special operations or forces that later decades of films have made the default image for night reconnaissance missions. They were Marines and Navy men who had figured out a methodology through practice and were now applying it under the highest possible operational stakes. The Yellow Beach reconnaissance found the barbed wire and the unscalable cliffs that ruled out the East Coast. Lieutenant Donald Neff's solo crawl through Japanese wire to within 30 yards of the beach interior, conducted while Japanese work crews could be heard nearby. and sentries swept flashlights across the sand, produced tactically decisive intelligence. I have no way to reconstruct what Neff thought in that moment, and I won't try, but the result of his observation that the Japanese were preparing defenses directly aimed at those beaches ruled out the East Coast conclusively. The White Beach reconnaissance ran into trouble immediately. A strong tidal current swept both teams north, and the White Beach 1 team never reached the island. The tidal current also swept Gunnery Sergeant Sam Lanford, Private First Class John Seaburn, and Lieutenant Commander Draper Kaufman, the UDT commander himself, off into the Saipan Channel when they missed the recovery boats in the low cloud and fog. They treaded water for several hours before being rescued by USS Dickerson. There's something about that detail, the fundamental physical vulnerability of even the most skilled operators in that war, that cuts through any romanticism about the period. A second reconnaissance of White Beach 2, conducted the following night with an improvised wire mesh radar reflector to help the ship guide the teams accurately to the beach, confirmed the absence of mines, obstacles, coral heads, boulders, and wire. The beach gradient was gentle. The cliffs flanking the beaches were 6 to 10 feet high in places, scalable without ladders or cargo nets. Captain Silverthorne's briefing to Rear Admiral Hill landed with the force of a decision made. "Admiral, the beaches are flat as a billiard table." Hill's answer: "You have convinced me." I should note, for those who track these things carefully, that the historiographical record on exactly how many swimmers were cut by the coral during these night reconnaissances is thin. Multiple accounts mention coral cuts as a hazard. None I've found give precise casualty figures for the reconnaissance phase itself. That's one of those gaps where I prefer to say so explicitly rather than fill it with reconstruction. The reconnaissance happened. The results were decisive. The specific human cost to the men who conducted it is, as best I can determine, not in the surviving documentation in the detail one would want. Chapter 6, Jelly Legs. At the waterline. Landing day, 24th of July, 1944 at 0717. The first wave of amphibious tractors. 8 LVTs for White Beach 1, 16 for White Beach 2. Crossed the line of departure and began the run toward the Tinian coast. The Marines in the first wave were carrying almost nothing. Coveralls, an M1 helmet with a camouflage cover, a weapon, emergency rations, a spoon, a spare pair of socks, a poncho, and insect repellent. Their packs had been left on Saipan. They would fight light, resupply on the island, and trust the logistics chain being assembled offshore. The cliff obstacle was solved by the Doodlebugs, modified LVTs fitted with ramps designed by Captain Paul Halloran, the ENF construction officer. They drove to the cliff face, hooked their ramps to the top, backed away, and left the ramps in place. 10 were built, 6 were used in the assault. They were strong enough to support a 35-ton Sherman tank. It's one of those solutions that sounds obvious in retrospect, and was probably maddening to work out at the time. The 24th Marines hit White Beach 1 first. Company E of the 2nd Battalion was first ashore, opposed by a small number of Japanese in crevices and a cave. Brief resistance quickly silenced. Within an hour, both the 1st and 2nd Battalions were ashore and moving inland. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the 2nd Battalion had reached the western edge of Airfield No. 3 and cut the main road linking Airfield No. 1 with the island's east coast. The pace of inland penetration surprised even the Marines themselves. White Beach 2 was harder. The 25th Marines landed in an area seeded with mines that hadn't been fully detected in pre-landing reconnaissance. 3 LVTs and a jeep were blown up, and it took 6 hours to clear the mine belt. The Japanese had also booby-trapped cases of beer and miscellaneous items with explosive charges. Men were killed by ordinary thirst and curiosity. The official account records this in a flat, factual register that is somehow more unsettling than elaboration would be. Meanwhile, the 2nd and 8th Marines conducted the diversionary feint against Tinian town. 22 landing craft approached the southwestern beaches until Japanese shore batteries opened fire. The craft made a second approach, then turned back 400 yards from the beach. Colonel Ogata sent a message to Tokyo reporting that his forces had repelled 100 landing barges and successfully defended against the main assault. At that same moment, more than 15,000 Marines were coming ashore at his back. The cost to the covering naval force during the feint was real. The battleship USS Colorado was struck 22 times, killing 43 and wounding 198. The destroyer Norman Scott lost her captain and 18 crew and lay briefly dead in the water. The commander of USS Cleveland then ignored orders to withdraw, reversed course, placed his ship between the Norman Scott and the Japanese battery, and absorbed hits to shield the crippled destroyer until her crew could get her engines running. It is generally accepted in the historical record that the Cleveland saved the Norman Scott. The Cleveland's commander wasn't following his orders. He was following his judgment. In that particular moment, they were the right thing to follow. By the evening of J-Day, 15,600 Marines, soldiers and sailors had landed on Tinian at a recorded cost of 15 killed and 225 wounded. The beachhead extended roughly a mile inland. 4 battalions of artillery were ashore. 48 medium Sherman tanks and 15 flame-throwing tanks were on the island. The Marines strung barbed wire, dug in, registered their artillery, and waited for what the night would bring. Every man among them knew what it would bring. The counterattack was coming, and what I want you to hold as we move into the next chapter, before the noise of that night takes over, is the weight of what had just been accomplished. An operation that nearly wasn't attempted at all had just deposited 15,000 men on 2 beaches barely wide enough to park a city block of vehicles. The deception had worked. The reconnaissance had proven itself. The island was barely 12 hours into its 9-day ordeal, and the most violent single night of that ordeal was still ahead, because the next chapter belongs to the night, and the night is going to be very loud. Chapter 7. The night belongs to nobody. The counterattacks, 24th into 25th of July 1944. There's a particular quality to combat at night on a small island that daylight fighting doesn't quite replicate, and I want to try to put you inside it before the chronology takes over. By the time full darkness fell on the 24th of July, 1944, the Marines of the 4th Division had a perimeter that ran roughly from White Beach 2 in the northwest, curved inland past the edge of Airfield No. 1, and hooked south toward a line that military maps would later label Phase Line 1. They'd moved quickly, far faster than any conservative pre-assault estimate had projected, and they'd done it against resistance that was real but fragmented. The Japanese defenders in the north hadn't expected an assault from those beaches, because their colonel hadn't expected it either. The first hours of J-Day had been less like a frontal battle and more like a collision between a moving object and a wall that wasn't quite finished being built. Now, with darkness, the wall was going to try to reassemble itself. Colonel Ogata understood by late afternoon that he'd been deceived. The messages coming in from his northern sector, fractured, delayed by the damage the pre-landing bombardment had done to his communication lines, told him that the real landing was at the White Beaches. His force at Tinian town had repelled a feint. His force at the White Beaches had been overrun in the first hours. The mobile counterattack reserve he'd positioned to respond to either contingency. The 1st Battalion of the 135th Infantry and the 12 light tanks of the tank company was still intact, but it was in the Mapo area in the island's center, and it would need time to move. Ogata issued his orders. Every available unit was to counterattack that night, not after careful preparation, not after consolidation and reconnaissance. That night, the existing operational orders, his standing instructions that each battalion would execute its own counterattack independently if communications were severed, meant that the night assault would not be a single coordinated attack. It would be a series of attacks from multiple directions at multiple points along the marine perimeter, across several hours of darkness. The first probing attacks began at approximately 11 o'clock that night. Small groups of Japanese infantry, estimated at platoon and company strength, struck the perimeter at several points along the northern and eastern edges of the marine line. These were not the main effort. They were exploratory, aggressive, and in several cases conducted by men who had clearly been fighting since the morning and were running short of options beyond personal determination. The Marines held their positions, used their pre-registered artillery fire, and waited. The after-action records describe this phase in the language of military reports. Repulsed, enemy driven back, perimeter held. But the individual accounts from veterans of this night are less sanitized. Sergeant John Pepper of the 25th Marines described the noise level in his post-war oral history as like being inside a metal shed while people threw rocks at it from every direction, except the rocks were killing you. I want to be precise. That description is from an oral history, not an after-action report, and the specific words are Pepper's as recorded. I cite it not for colour, but because it contradicts the tidiness of official documentation. The main counterattack came later, between roughly midnight and 2 in the morning. It came from two primary directions. The larger attack, estimated at somewhere between 700 and 1,000 men, hit the sector of the marine perimeter held by the 1st Battalion, 25th Marines. The Japanese advanced, in the phrase that appears in multiple accounts, in closely packed formations. This is one of those historical details that military analysts still debate. The extent to which Japanese banzai charges in the late Pacific War represented organized tactical doctrine versus individual unit decisions driven by desperation and the specific ethos of the Imperial Army's code against surrender or retreat. What the survivors of the 1st Battalion, 25th Marines recorded was this. They had their artillery registered. They had their barbed wire in place. They had their automatic weapons positioned for interlocking fields of fire. And when the attack came, they used all three. The assault formations struck the wire entanglements and were stopped. The Marines fired. The artillery fired. A continuous barrage of support from the Xive Corps artillery batteries still on Saipan and the divisional artillery that had landed during J-Day. The half-tracks mounting 75mm guns in the perimeter's interior fired canister rounds, essentially giant shotgun shells that scattered hundreds of steel balls at close range. The coordinated defensive fire killed at the wire faster than the attacking formation could advance through it. By the time this phase of the counterattack broke off, between 2 and 3 in the morning, the ground in front of the 1st Battalion's position was, in the understated language of the official Marine Corps history, heavily covered with enemy casualties. I don't want to elaborate that observation more than the record requires. The facts carry their own weight. The tank assault was the second major component of the night's fighting, and it arrived around the same time as the infantry wave. 12 Japanese light tanks, almost certainly the tanks of the 18th Infantry Regiment's tank company that Ogata had held in reserve, advanced down the main road from the Mappo area toward the marine perimeter in a column. They were not accompanied by effective infantry support, which would prove critical. They moved fast, and they hit the perimeter with determination. The records are clear on what stopped them. A combination of marine bazooka teams, half-tracks, 37mm anti-tank guns from the Marine Weapons Companies, and, crucially, the Sherman tanks of the 4th Tank Battalion, which had been positioned precisely to handle a counterattack of this kind. The Japanese light tanks were Model 97 Chihus and lighter variants. Their armor plating was not designed to withstand the 75mm rounds of a Sherman. The engagement was brief, decisive, and effectively ended Japanese armored capability on Tinian in a single night engagement. All 12 light tanks were either destroyed or disabled before dawn. The official count recorded in the Marine Corps historical monograph for this battle tallied the night's Japanese casualties at approximately 1,200 killed. I want to note, for the sake of precision, that battlefield body counts in the Pacific War were notoriously unreliable in both directions, and this figure appears in the source as an estimate derived from post-battle surveys of the ground. It is the number the historians have used, and I use it with that caveat clearly attached. By 4:30 in the morning on the 25th of July, the counterattacks had exhausted themselves. The Marine perimeter held along its entire length. The artillery had fired throughout the night, consuming enormous quantities of ammunition that was already being resupplied from the LSTs offshore. The Sherman tanks were intact. The barbed wire was damaged in sections, but had done the work it was designed to do. What the night had consumed, beyond ammunition, was something harder to quantify. The Japanese garrison's organized capacity to resist. Ogata still had men, thousands of them, distributed in fortified positions across the rest of the island. But he had lost his tank force in a single night. He had lost the concentrated infantry reserve in piecemeal attacks that hadn't broken the perimeter at any point. What remained was a fighting retreat, a series of defensive positions from which his men would resist for another 8 days before the last organized resistance collapsed. The battle for Tinian was, in the strategic sense, decided in those few hours of darkness. What followed was the work of clearing a decision already made. I find myself returning, whenever I read the accounts of this night, to a particular aspect of the planning that made the defensive success possible, and that doesn't receive the credit it deserves in the popular narrative. The decision to land at the White Beaches, the decision that Turner resisted and Smith fought for, meant that the Marines landed in a sector where Ogata hadn't concentrated his heavy weapons. It meant that the artillery could be landed on J-Day, because the beach approaches were clear of the coast defense guns that guarded Sunharan Bay, and it meant that the Sherman tanks got ashore before dark, which was decisive. If the Marines had landed at Tinian Town, if Turner had won the argument on the Rocky Mount, those tanks wouldn't have been on the island by nightfall, because the beach approaches would have been contested by the very coast defense guns that the Colorado had to destroy during the feint on J-Day. The defensive success of the night of the 24th into the 25th wasn't just about bravery or firepower. It was about decisions made weeks earlier in a conference room by officers arguing about the width of beaches. There's a final element of this night that I want to name before we move south with the Marines, because it belongs to the story and tends to get absorbed into the larger statistics. The medical personnel on Tinian on the night of the 24th, the battalion surgeons, the Navy corpsmen embedded with Marine rifle companies, the men running the beach aid stations, worked through the entire night under fire, in darkness, with whatever supplies had made it ashore in the first 12 hours. The wounded from J-Day were being treated simultaneously with the wounded from the night counterattacks. The landing craft used for casualty evacuation from the beach were the same craft, still bringing supplies ashore. The official casualty figures for the first day and first night combined a total of 105 killed and 536 wounded for the first 48 hours of the battle. represent the work that medical personnel managed at the edge of what equipment and training and human endurance could sustain. They are numbers I find I cannot read quickly. Chapter 8. Pushing South. The drive down Tinian, 25th to 29th of July, 1944. The morning of the 25th of July began with the survivors of the night counterattack still on the ground in front of the Marine perimeter, and the 4th Marine Division already adjusting its lines for the day's advance. The plan for the capture of Tinian was conceptually straightforward. Establish a line across the island's width, advance south, compress the Japanese garrison into the southern tip, and eliminate resistance systematically. The 2nd Marine Division, which had conducted the feint on J-Day, was now being brought ashore through the White Beaches to take its place on the left flank of the advance. By the evening of the 25th, the 2-division assault force was organized, resupplied, and moving south. What lay ahead of them was 8 days of fighting through terrain that changed character almost daily. Open airfield approaches, tangled secondary jungle, limestone ravines, sugarcane fields that offered concealment to defenders and limited visibility to attackers, and the southern ridge system, where Ogata's remaining organized units were prepared to make their final stand. Major General Harry Schmidt, commanding the northern troops and landing force, had 4 Marine regiments in the assault. 2 from the 4th Division on the right, 2 from the 2nd Division on the left, plus all supporting arms. Divisional artillery, corps artillery fire from Saipan, naval gunfire support from the cruisers and destroyers offshore, and air support from carrier-based aircraft, and the Army P-47 Thunderbolts still flying from Aslito Field. The combined firepower available to Schmidt was, in relation to the size of the island and the number of defenders, extraordinary. The Japanese garrison had lost its tanks, its mobile reserve, and a substantial fraction of its combat infantry in the first night's fighting. What it retained were its prepared defensive positions, the caves, bunkers, and fortified farmhouses that studded the interior. Its determination, its relatively small but effective artillery in the southern hills, and the advantage that any defending force enjoys on a narrow island where the attacker must advance along predictable axes. The capture of the central airfields. Airfield number 1 at Ushi Point, Airfield number 2 in the center of the island, and the partially complete Airfield number 3, was accomplished faster than the operational planners had projected. Airfield number 1 fell on the 24th of July itself, taken by the 24th Marines as they drove east across the island's northern plateau. The Seabees of Naval Construction Battalions 8, 93, 101, 115, and 121 were already moving inland behind the infantry to begin surveying for construction. The speed with which the airfield fell, combined with the flat terrain, would later make possible one of the most remarkable construction achievements of the entire Pacific War. But that story belongs to a later chapter. For now, the Seabees were simply noting what they would need to build, while the Marines moved past them, heading south. The advance through the cane fields is described in veteran accounts with a consistency that suggests something beyond individual impression. The sugarcane of Tinian in July 1944 was tall, commonly 6 to 8 feet, and grew in dense rows separated by drainage ditches roughly every 100 feet or so. Visibility in the cane was measured in feet rather than yards. Patrols moving through the fields could be within 30 yards of a hidden Japanese position without knowing it. The ditches provided natural defensive lines and natural ambush positions. The Marine tactic was to burn the cane ahead of the advance using the M1 flamethrower and the armoured LVT flame tanks. The Ronson conversions, called that because of their infamous nickname for the cigarette lighter of the same name, always light first time. This reduced visibility problems, flushed defenders from prepared positions, and allowed the infantry to advance on cleared ground. It also consumed time, created smoke that complicated air observation, and, on the hotter days of the campaign, made the interior of the island into something that veterans struggled to describe without reaching for extremes. The fighting on the 26th and 27th of July centered on the airfield number 2 area and the town of Gergua in the island's middle section. Japanese resistance at this stage was increasingly fragmented. Individual platoons and companies defending specific positions without effective coordination from above. Because Ogata's communication network had been systematically destroyed by bombardment, and advancing marine patrols had cut the last intact telephone lines on the 25th. The Japanese were fighting, in many cases, without knowing where their regimental commander was or what his intentions were. That's not a condition under which organized tactical defense can function, and the Americans knew it. Schmidt maintained constant pressure, refusing to allow the Japanese line to consolidate or rest. Night attacks by Marines, a tactic that reversed the usual Pacific War equation, where the Americans typically defended at night and the Japanese attacked, further disrupted the Japanese ability to move or reorganize in darkness. The cost of this advance was not negligible. The 4th Marine Division's after-action report for the Tinian operation records a series of company-level engagements from the 26th through the 29th that each involved casualties in double figures. The most costly day of the advance phase was the 28th of July, when the assault ran into the prepared defensive positions at the base of the Southern Ridge System, a line of caves and bunkers extending across the full width of the island, reinforced with mortars, machine guns, and the remaining artillery that Ogata had pulled back into the ridgeline. The 1st Battalion, 23rd Marines, lost more men on the 28th than on any other single day of the campaign. The specific engagements, reduction of fortified farmhouses, clearing of cave systems, appear in company morning reports in the precise administrative language that military bureaucracy uses regardless of what the action actually felt like. I read those reports and I find myself doing the arithmetic that the language is designed not to do for you. 4 men here, 7 there, a sergeant major and 2 privates at a named road junction. They add up. By the evening of the 29th of July, the front line ran across the southern quarter of the island. North of that line, Tinian was essentially in American hands, not pacified, not free of individual Japanese holdouts and cave defenders, but under Marine control. South of that line, the surviving Japanese garrison was compressed into the island's narrowest section, where the limestone ridges provided natural defensive positions, and the terrain would briefly slow the American advance. Ogata, as best the subsequent record can establish, was still somewhere in that southern sector, still issuing orders that some of his remaining troops were still attempting to carry out. The island's geography had turned into a funnel. The Marines were at the wide end, pushing south. The Japanese were at the narrow end, with nowhere to go. I want to pause here and address something that the tactical narrative of this advance tends to smooth over in its emphasis on progress rates and phase line times. The Japanese soldiers defending these positions in the central and southern sectors of Tinian in the last week of July 1944 were fighting without any realistic prospect of relief, reinforcement, or rescue. The carrier aircraft and long-range maritime patrol planes that the American naval force had deployed around the island ensured that no surface vessel could approach Tinian without being detected and attacked. The Japanese garrison on Tinian, once the assault began, was on its own. Every man in that garrison knew by the 25th of July, at the latest, that Saipan had fallen. that the combined fleet had been decisively defeated at the Battle of the Philippine Sea on the 19th and 20th of June, and that the Marianas were permanently lost to Japan. They were fighting for an island that their own high command had already written off. Understanding that context doesn't change the tactical record, but it is, I think, essential for understanding the human reality beneath it. Chapter 9, The Last Ridge, The Southern Fighting, 30th of July to 1st of August, 1944. The Southern Ridge system of Tinian, the limestone heights in the island's final third, is visible on satellite imagery today as a slightly rougher interruption of the otherwise flat terrain, softened by decades of vegetation growth and the quiet pace of peace. In July of 1944, it was the last organized defensive line available to Colonel Agata's garrison, and the scene of the bloodiest fighting of the 9-day battle. The Marines called the terrain rough country in their operational language. Veterans' accounts were less restrained. Private First Class Robert Dallas of the 3rd Battalion, 24th Marines, in a letter written to his family 3 weeks after the battle and declassified decades later, described the southern ridgeline approaches as all limestone and dark, with the caves running back where you couldn't see how far. I use that description not as colour, but as the record of a specific observation about the physical character of the terrain that shaped the fighting. The southern advance began on the 30th of July with all 4 regiments in line, the 2nd and 8th Marines on the left, the 23rd and 24th Marines on the right. The 2nd Marine Division's participation in the ground assault, having come ashore through the white beaches after J-Day, added fresh strength to the attacking line at precisely the point where the terrain was going to make the advance most difficult. Schmidt's operational instinct was sound. Maintain maximum pressure, keep both divisions fully engaged, allow no rest and no gap through which the remaining Japanese force could reorganize. The objective for the 30th was the Lasso Carolinas line, a designated east-west phase line running through the village of Carolinas and south of Mount Lasso's secondary features. The objective for the 31st was the Tinian town area itself. Tinian town, the administrative and commercial center of the island under the Japanese civilian administration, had been the most heavily bombarded section of the island. What the Marines entered on the 31st of July was, in the description of Lieutenant Colonel Don Robertson, the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, a collection of walls and rubble with the town plan visible, but none of the buildings intact. Robertson's observation is in the official historical monograph. I use it as a specific attributed description rather than as general characterization. The harbour facilities, the pier, the warehouses, the boat basin were damaged but partially usable, and marine engineers began assessing them for supply utility almost immediately. The town itself was cleared building by building, cave by cave, ruin by ruin, over the course of the 31st of July and into the 1st of August. The caves of the southern cliffs were a different problem from the pillboxes and fortified buildings of the central advance. They were natural limestone formations, deepened in many cases by Japanese military engineering over the months of preparation before the invasion, capable of sheltering dozens of defenders in positions that artillery and naval gunfire couldn't easily reach. The standard marine technique for cave reduction was sequential: machine gun fire to suppress anyone at the cave mouth, followed by flamethrowers to drive defenders back from the entrance, followed by demolition charges, satchel charges or pole charges, pushed or thrown into the interior, followed by more flamethrower fire, and finally sealing with explosives if the cave was too deep to fully clear. Each cave was its own separate operation, conducted by a small team under fire, with no guarantee about what was inside before the work began. Some caves held a handful of defenders, some held dozens. Some held wounded Japanese soldiers who couldn't be evacuated and had been left with weapons. Some, as the Marines began to discover, held civilians. The presence of Japanese civilians in the southern cliff areas created one of the most documented and, in retrospect, most significant humanitarian crises of the Pacific Island campaign. The civilian population of Tinian, approximately 18,000 at the time of the American landing, had been directed by Japanese military authorities and civilian administrators to evacuate southward ahead of the American advance. By the time the Marine assault reached the southern cliffs, thousands of Japanese and Okinawan civilians were concentrated in the caves and rough terrain of the island's tip. American forces used loudspeakers and distributed leaflets, prepared by the Japanese-American linguists serving with the Marine intelligence sections, urging civilians to surrender. Some did, many more did not, either from fear, from belief in Japanese propaganda about American treatment of captives, or from the direct intervention of Japanese military personnel who, in documented instances, prevented or discouraged civilian surrender. The official Marine Corps historical monograph records that more than 13,000 civilians were eventually taken under American military custody, processed through a civil internment compound established near Shuro, and provided with food, water, and medical care. The gap between the estimated 18,000 pre-invasion civilian population and the 13,000 in American custody after the battle represents one of the most painful unresolved arithmetic problems in the Tinian historical record. The fighting in the southern cliffs reached its most intense phase on the 31st of July and the 1st of August. Organized Japanese resistance, meaning units that were still operating under command direction, however fractured, was compressed into the southwest promontory south of Tinian town and the sea cliffs east of the town along the island's southeast shore. The 31st Army Staff Officer Major Kiyoshi Yoshida, one of the few Japanese officers to survive the battle and be taken prisoner, described in his interrogation the situation on Tinian town's southern approach as entirely without coordination by the 31st of July. Officers were issuing orders that didn't reach their intended recipients. Communications between company and battalion level had completely broken down. Individual positions were fighting independently, waiting to be destroyed in turn. Yoshida's account, recorded in the V Amphibious Corps' intelligence report after the battle, is one of the clearest primary source windows into what the Japanese command experience on Tinian looked like from the inside. Colonel Ogata was killed at some point during the final phase of the southern fighting. The official American records place his death on the 1st of August, 1944, though the exact location and circumstances are not precisely documented in the sources I've reviewed. Captain Goichi Oi, the naval commander who had served under Ogata throughout the battle, died in the same general period and in the same southern sector. With their deaths, organized resistance on Tinian effectively ended, though the process of physical clearance of the island's cave systems, southern cliffs, and jungle interior would continue for weeks. The battle was officially declared over on the 1st of August, 1944, 8 days and 21 hours, after the first Marines had stepped off their amphibious tractors at the White Beaches on the morning of the 24th of July. The final American casualty count, as recorded in the official Marine Corps sources, was 328 killed in action and 1,571 wounded. That total is frequently contrasted in the histories with the casualty rate at Tarawa, the alternative that Holland Smith had warned against, where the same number of men had been killed on a far smaller beachhead in a battle that lasted less than 100 hours. The contrast is useful. but I want to be careful with it. Casualty comparisons between Pacific Island battles tend to flatten the specific human reality of each. 328 men killed is not a small number. The families of those men didn't experience their loss as a statistical validation of the White Beach decision. I note the comparison because the historical record makes it, and it has legitimate analytical value. I note it carefully because the numbers represent real people, and those people deserve more than to be used as proof of a planning argument. Chapter 10, The Island After the Storm, Mopping Up, and the Human Costa Quieter chapter, slower, the pace of aftermath rather than assault. The declaration that organized resistance on Tinian had ended on the 1st of August, 1944, was accurate in the sense that mattered militarily. There was no longer a functioning Japanese command structure issuing coordinated tactical orders to surviving units. It was misleading in several other senses. The cave systems in the southern cliffs still held armed Japanese soldiers. The jungle scrub in the interior concealed individuals and small groups who hadn't surrendered and had no intention of doing so. The civilian internment compound at Churo was processing thousands of traumatized, malnourished, and in many cases, badly wounded people. Japanese colonists, Okinawan contract workers and their families, who had spent the previous 9 days in conditions that don't reduce to any single description, and the work of clearing, identifying, and making the island safe for the construction program that would transform it, was only just beginning. The mopping up phase, a term that the official histories use, and that I want to examine briefly, because it does the rhetorical work of minimizing what it describes, continued on to Tinian for weeks after the formal end of the battle. Patrols from the garrison units left to hold the island while the assault divisions prepared for the next operation. The 4th Marine Division would go to Iwo Jima. The 2nd would go to Saipan, conducted daily sweeps of the cave areas, the cliff margins, and the interior scrub. The weekly intelligence summaries from the island's garrison command in August and September of 1944 record the capture or killing of armed Japanese individuals and small groups with a frequency that makes clear the mopping up involved real fighting and real casualties, though the numbers in this phase are not consolidated in the standard secondary sources with the same precision as the main battle figures. The cave clearances generated the most extended and the most ethically complicated operational decisions of the entire Tinian campaign. In multiple documented instances, American military personnel using loudspeakers offered surrender terms, provided food and water at cave entrances, and waited for hours for responses that sometimes came and sometimes didn't. The Japanese-American Nissei interpreters, linguists from the Military Intelligence Service attached to the Marine divisions, played a critical role in these situations that the combat narrative tends to flatten. Their work was not only translation. It was, in the field, a form of negotiation conducted between men who had grown up in the country being asked to surrender, and the relatives, sometimes literally the relatives, of the people they were asking to come out. Sergeant Kantagami and other MIS linguists who served on Tinian are documented in the regimental and divisional records as having participated in these cave clearances. Their specific individual accounts are less available to the researcher than those of the combat Marines, and that imbalance in the archive is, in my view, a significant historiographical gap. The civilian internment compound at Churo became one of the larger such facilities in the Pacific Theater. American military administrators, working under the constraints of wartime supply lines that were simultaneously trying to support active combat operations on Guam, which was still being fought after Tinian fell, provided rice, canned goods, and medical attention. The compound's population included people with no connection to the Japanese military administration of the island. Okinawan contract workers and their families, who had been brought to Tinian before the war to work in the cane fields, and who had no homeland to return to since Okinawa was still under Japanese control. Their legal and administrative status under military occupation was, in the simplest terms, undefined. They were neither prisoners of war nor free civilians under any framework that 1944 military law had clearly anticipated. They were, in a phrase that appears in the V Amphibious Corps' administrative records, civilian internees, a category being invented in real time by administrators who were doing their best with frameworks that hadn't been designed for the situation they found. The Japanese military dead on Tinian were tallied, as precisely as the circumstances allowed, during the post-battle clearance operation. The official American count placed the total Japanese military dead at approximately 5,400. The records acknowledge this figure as an estimate. Not all dead were recovered. Some were sealed in caves by demolition charges, and the conditions of the southern fighting made comprehensive accounting impossible. Prisoners, Japanese soldiers who had survived and surrendered, a group that was extremely small by the standards of Pacific Island battles in this period, numbered approximately 252 at the official close of the campaign. Among those taken prisoner were a number of Korean and Okinawan laborers who had been conscripted into labor and quasi-military service. Their specific experiences on Tinian and their post-battle treatment are documented in the administrative records of the island garrison and deserve more attention from historians than they have received in the popular literature. I want to spend a paragraph on the question of Japanese holdouts on Tinian because it connects the immediate aftermath of the battle to a much longer human story. The pattern established at every island in the Central Pacific Campaign, where some Japanese military personnel refused to surrender and continued to resist for months, years, or in some cases decades after the formal end of operations, was repeated on Tinian. The island's garrison records from late 1944 and 1945 document the continued encounter with armed holdouts at irregular intervals. By the time the war ended in August 1945, there were still surviving Japanese military personnel in Tinian's cave and jungle areas. Some surrendered after official Japanese officers were brought to the island to personally inform them that the war had ended. Some didn't come out until much later. The last individual holdout on Tinian, the specific date and name, are not in the sources I've reviewed with the precision I'd need to state them confidently, is believed to have surrendered sometime in 1945 or 1946. I note this not as a curiosity, but as a reminder of what ideological conditioning and isolated individual experience can sustain far beyond any institutional logic. The Marines who left Tinian in August and September of 1944, the 4th Division bound for rest and re-equipping before Iwo Jima, the 2nd Division heading to Saipan, left behind an island that looked, in the early weeks of the aftermath, more like a construction site than a battlefield. The Seabees had been working since the day after the landing, and their progress was already visible. Where Ogata's garrison had maintained 4 operational or partially complete airfields, American military engineers were planning something on an entirely different scale. The island that the Japanese had developed as a sugarcane colony was about to become the largest airfield complex in the world. The transformation would take months, require the labor of more than 13,000 Seabees and construction troops, and consume quantities of equipment and material that would strain the Pacific Fleet's logistics, even at its 1944 peak. But it would work, and what it produced would change everything about the last year of the war. in ways that none of the men who built it, and very few of the people who ordered it built, fully understood at the time. Chapter 11. The Seabees Build a World, Northfield, Westfield, and the Transformation of Tinian, August 1944 to June 1945. I want to be direct about something before we get into the details of what the Naval Construction Battalions did on Tinian, because the construction story is one that tends to get folded into the atomic bomb narrative, and thereby loses its own distinct significance. What happened on Tinian between August of 1944 and June of 1945 was considered purely as an engineering and logistics achievement, one of the most extraordinary military construction projects in history. The atomic bomb used those runways, but those runways would have existed and would have mattered even without the atomic bomb. The B-29 bombing campaign against Japan was conducted from Tinian regardless of the Manhattan Project, and it was killing tens of thousands of Japanese civilians in the firebombing raids of March through August 1945. The construction achievement on Tinian was not incidental to an atomic story. It was a full story of its own, with its own logic and its own cost. The Seabees, the nickname derived from the initials CB, for construction battalions, who arrived on Tinian were not, in the main, young men with no civilian experience. The construction battalions had been organized in December 1941, specifically to use the trades and engineering skills of men who would otherwise have been too old for combat service. The average CB in 1944 was in his mid-30s. They were carpenters, electricians, welders, heavy equipment operators, pipe fitters, concrete workers, and civil engineers who had spent their civilian lives building things. They had been given rifles and trained in basic infantry skills because they would be working in and behind combat zones. But their primary tool was not the M1 Garand. It was the D8 Caterpillar bulldozer, and they drove it with the same professional familiarity that the Marines carried their weapons. The plan for Tinian's airfield development was produced by the 20th Air Force's Engineering Section and approved by General Hap Arnold's headquarters in Washington. It called for 6 runways on Northfield, arrayed in 2 parallel pairs running from northwest to southeast, and 1 pair running east-west, giving the field a total usable runway length that no single airfield in the world at that point could match. Each runway was to be 8,500 feet long and 500 feet wide, dimensions designed specifically for the B-29, whose length and weight requirements were well beyond those of any previous bomber. The surface was to be crushed coral, packed and rolled to a depth sufficient to support a fully loaded superfortress, roughly 67 tons at maximum gross weight. 2 more runways were to be built at Westfield on the island's southwest plateau, making Tinian's total runway capacity 6 runways capable of launching B-29 simultaneously in both directions from both ends. At the peak of the construction effort, it was estimated that a fully loaded B-29 could take off from Tinian every 45 seconds. The coral crushing operation was the heart of the construction effort and its defining logistical challenge. Tinian's limestone terrain was essentially the raw material. Coral rock was blasted from quarry sites, crushed by portable rock-crushing plants, transported by dump truck and conveyor belt to the runway sites, graded by bulldozer, and then compacted by heavy rolling equipment. The quantities involved were enormous, the equivalent of moving millions of cubic yards of material across an island that had, until recently, been a battlefield. The road network required to support this movement had to be built essentially from scratch, because the existing Japanese road system was designed for agricultural traffic, not for the weight of heavy construction equipment and the volume of material flow the airfield project demanded. The Seabees built that road network concurrently with the runway construction, using the same crushed coral aggregate and the same equipment. By the time Northfield was complete, Tinian had a road network that was, in paved lane miles, comparable to a moderate-sized American city. The accommodation for the air groups that would fly from Tinian was a separate construction challenge of similar scale. The Seabees built housing for more than 50,000 military personnel, the ground and air crews of the bomb groups that would operate from the island in the form of Quonset hut installations across the island's northern plateau. They built a hospital complex at Tinian Town, capable of treating the casualties from both combat and the ongoing air campaign operations. They built fuel storage, ammunition storage, maintenance facilities, power generation plants, water distillation units, sewage treatment systems, and a communications network. They built a cold storage plant large enough to provide refrigerated food storage for 50,000 men in a tropical climate. They built a bakery producing tens of thousands of loaves of bread per day. The Camp Tinian that emerged from this construction effort was not an improvised field camp. It was a small city built in under a year on a sugarcane island in the Western Pacific by men who had learned their trades building bridges and highways and warehouses in Depression-era and wartime America. The timeline was brutal. Northfield's first 2 runways were declared operationally ready in October of 1944. Roughly 2 months after the construction began, on an island that had been the site of intense combat only weeks before. The first B-29 sorties from Tinian launched in late October. Westfield was operational by the end of 1944. The full 6-runway Northfield complex was completed in the spring of 1945, by which point the 20th Air Force's Marianas-based bomber fleet had grown to more than 500 B-29s, capable of putting up a 300-plane strike. The construction effort never entirely stopped. Modifications, extensions, repairs, and new facilities were being added continuously. But the core infrastructure was in place by early 1945, in time for the operations that would define the last phase of the Pacific War. I've spent time trying to convey the scale of this construction effort in terms that do justice to it, and I keep running into the same problem. The numbers are so large that they risk becoming abstract. So let me try a different measure. In the autumn of 1944, the island of Tinian had fewer than 50 square miles of land area and had been 3 months earlier a sugar plantation with a garrison of 8,000 soldiers. By the spring of 1945, it hosted more than 50,000 American military personnel, 6 of the longest runways in the world, a functional city of support infrastructure, and an air fleet capable of putting more aircraft over Tokyo in a single night than the Japanese home islands had faced at any point in the war. The transformation from one thing to the other happened in less than 9 months. The Seabees who built it, the engineers who planned it, and the supply chain that fed it with material across the Central Pacific deserve to be named as one of the decisive factors in the Pacific War. They usually aren't. That's what this chapter is for. The human cost of the construction operation tends to be absorbed into the broader statistics of Pacific theater non-combat casualties, which makes it difficult to isolate. Construction accidents on a project of this scale and pace, with heavy equipment operating around the clock on uneven terrain, with explosives in frequent use, with men working double shifts in tropical heat, were not infrequent, and the medical records of the construction battalions on Tinian document injuries and deaths that don't appear in the battle casualty counts. The Seabee dead on Tinian, those killed in the construction phase rather than the combat phase, are commemorated on the island's memorials alongside the Marines and soldiers who died in the assault. That's the appropriate place for them. They were building the infrastructure of a campaign that was killing people on the other end of the runways they paved. Chapter 12. The 509th comes to Tinian, the Manhattan Project's westernmost outpost. There is a compound on the northeastern edge of Tinian's North Field that does not appear in the standard tourist materials about the island and is not prominently marked on most contemporary maps. It is a fenced area of perhaps 60 acres, today overgrown, its concrete foundations cracked and lifted by the roots of tropical vegetation. That was, in the summer of 1945, the most secure military installation in the Pacific Theater. It was the home of the 509th Composite Group, commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets, and it was where the operational components of the atomic bomb were assembled before their use. The 509th was not, from the outside, a recognizable unit with an obvious purpose. It had its own fenced perimeter within the larger Northfield complex, its own security detail, its own supply chain, its own orders that ran directly from the Manhattan Project's chain of command, rather than through the standard 20th Air Force hierarchy. The men of the other bomb groups on Tinian knew the 509th was there. They did not know what it was for, and asking was firmly discouraged. The 509th Composite Group had been activated on the 17th of December, 1944, at Wendover Field in Utah, one of the most isolated Army Air Force bases in the continental United States, chosen specifically for its remoteness. Tibbets had been selected personally to command it by the project's leadership, based on his record as a combat pilot. He'd flown B-17s in both the European and North African theaters, and on his character assessment as someone who could maintain absolute operational security under conditions of intense pressure. The group trained at Wendover for 8 months, flying a modified version of the B-29 called the Silver Plate, stripped of all defensive armament except the tail guns, modified to carry the specific shapes of the atomic bomb designs, fitted with improved engines and fuel capacity, and maintained to standards that the standard 20th Air Force bomb groups were not required to meet. The Silver Plate B-29s were not more heavily armored than standard versions. They were lighter, faster, and higher flying, because the theory of operation was that a single aircraft or a pair of aircraft could penetrate Japanese airspace at high altitude without fighter escort, drop the weapon, and outrun the blast. The 509th began arriving on Tinian in June of 1945. Their compound was constructed by the Seabees to 509th specifications. The bomb assembly buildings had specially reinforced concrete floors, capable of handling the weight of the bomb assemblies, climate-controlled interiors to protect the electronics and the initiator systems, and security fencing with armed guard posts around the perimeter. The bomb components themselves, codenamed Little Boy for the uranium gun-type device and Fat Man for the plutonium implosion device, arrived on the island by separate means. The uranium components of Little Boy arrived aboard the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis, which delivered them to Tinian on the 26th of July 1945, and then departed for the Philippines. The Indianapolis was sunk 4 days later by the Japanese submarine I-58, and due to a communications failure, the loss wasn't reported for nearly 4 days. Of the 880 men who went into the water, approximately 317 survived. The Indianapolis's role in the Tinian story, arriving quietly, offloading components for a weapon that would end the war, and then being lost before anyone noticed, is one of the most devastating sequences of events in the entire Pacific War. The assembly of the bombs on Tinian was conducted by teams from the Manhattan Project's Los Alamos laboratory under the supervision of scientists, including Captain William Parsons, the naval ordnance expert who would fly on the Enola Gay as bomb commander. I want to be careful here because the bomb assembly process is a topic on which the published record is substantial, but the specific technical details I can responsibly include are those in the authorized historical sources. Primarily, the Manhattan Project's own history and the accounts of participants like Parsons, Tibbets, and the physicist Norman Ramsey, who supervised the assembly operations. The assembly buildings still standing on Tinian today, Bomb Assembly Building 1, designated as a National Historic Landmark, are the physical remnant of this process. Their concrete walls, their pit into which the bomb was lowered for loading into the aircraft, their cramped interiors where scientists worked with components that represented the cutting edge of nuclear physics applied to military purpose. These are real places that survive, and they matter as physical testimony in a way that description can only approximate. The 509th preliminary operations in June and July of 1945. A series of practice and calibration missions flown against Japanese targets in the Hiroshima region and other cities using conventionally armed bomb shapes called pumpkins were not appreciated by the other 20th Air Force Group. The 509th flew with small formations, wasn't part of the massive night firebombing raids being conducted by the other groups, and appeared to the rest of the command to be conducting operations that lacked the urgency of the main campaign. Group commanders complained through channels. The complaints were noted and not addressed, because the 509th's operational security couldn't be compromised by explaining what the practice missions were for. Tibbets, by his own account, simply endured the professional friction with the knowledge of what was coming. The other groups didn't have that knowledge, and the tension it created in the day-to-day social environment of the Northfield complex is documented in the memoirs of several 509th veterans. The specific targeting decisions that placed Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the top of the target list, and the deliberations that surrounded those decisions, were made at levels of command well above Tinian, in Washington, Los Alamos, and the 20th Air Force's headquarters on Guam. The role of Tinian in that process was essentially logistical and operational. It was where the weapons were, and it was from where the missions would fly. The targeting committee's selection of Hiroshima, its deliberate exclusion of Kyoto from the list, the decision to use the weapons without the demonstration that some Manhattan Project scientists had advocated, the absence of a specific surrender ultimatum that named the atomic bomb. These decisions are documented in the Stimson Papers, the Target Committee records, and the accounts of participants, including Secretary of War Henry Stimson, General Leslie Groves, and Oppenheimer. They were made in rooms far from Tinian, but they came to rest ultimately on the runways at Northfield. I want to end this chapter with something I've thought about for a long time, because I think it's central to understanding what Tinian was and is. The island was built as an atomic bomb platform. It was seized because it was flat and could hold runways. It was developed to support B-29s flying conventional bombing raids. The atomic mission was, in the clearest sense, an afterthought imposed on an infrastructure built for conventional strategic bombing. And yet the island became, almost by accident, almost as a function of its own geography, the place from which the most consequential single military actions in history were launched. The Marines who died on the white beaches and the southern cliffs of Tinian were not dying to build an atomic bomb base. They were dying to seize an airfield. The Seabees who built Northfield were not building a nuclear launch platform. They were building B-29 runways. The men of the 509th, who assembled and loaded their weapons in the bomb assembly buildings, were doing a job that they had been trained for and ordered to do. within a chain of command that ran to the President of the United States. The moral weight of what that chain of command decided does not rest on Tinian, or on its marine defenders, or on its CB builders, but it passed through Tinian, and that passage, that fact of physical geography, is why this island matters in a way that no other island of similar size in any other ocean can quite match. Chapter 13, Enola Gay, The Mission from Northfield, 6th of August, 1945. There are moments in history that the record preserves in such detail that the researcher's job becomes one of restraint rather than recovery. The 6th of August, 1945 is one of those moments. The documents exist. The testimonies exist. The mission log exists. The photographs exist. And yet, for all that documentation, there is something about what happened in the early morning hours on the northeastern corner of Tinian that resists the comfortable neatness of a complete account. Because what happened there that morning was not simply a military mission. It was a threshold, and thresholds are harder to document than the events on either side of them. Colonel Paul Tibbets had been briefed on the primary target, Hiroshima, on the 2nd of August, 1945, at a meeting in the 509th briefing room on Tinian. The targeting order came from General Carl Spaatz, commanding the United States Army Strategic Air Forces, who had received it from General of the Army George C. Marshall and the War Department. Hiroshima was selected because it was a major military and industrial headquarters city, had been largely untouched by the conventional bombing campaign that had devastated most other major Japanese cities, and was of a size and configuration that would allow a meaningful demonstration of the weapon's effect. The targeting committee had also noted, in language that appears in the declassified records, that the surrounding terrain, Hiroshima is set in a broad, flat delta ringed by hills, would concentrate the blast effect. That observation, made in a Washington conference room, would prove devastatingly accurate. The preparation on Tinian, on the night of the 5th into the 6th of August, was witnessed by more people than is sometimes appreciated. The loading of the Little Boy device, the uranium gun-type bomb weighing approximately 9,000 pounds, roughly 10 feet long and 28 inches in diameter, into the bomb bay of Tibbets's B-29, named Enola Gay after his mother, was done at the bomb-loading pit in the assembly area under floodlights, in the presence of photographers, assembled ground crew, and the scientists and ordnance officers responsible for the weapon. Captain William Parsons, who would fly the mission as bomb commander and who had supervised the weapons assembly, made the operational decision that the bomb would be armed. The cordite propellant charges inserted into the gun mechanism, in flight after takeoff rather than before. He had watched several B-29s crash and burn on Northfield's runways during the previous weeks. A fully armed atomic bomb on an aircraft that crashed on takeoff was not a scenario he was willing to accept. He practiced the arming procedure in the aircraft's unpressurized bomb bay until he could do it in the dark. Enola Gay lifted off from Northfield's runway Able at 02:45 on the 6th of August, 1945. It was the longest runway on the airfield, 8,500 feet of compacted coral, and the aircraft needed most of it. At full gross weight with the Little Boy weapon, the B-29 was operating at or near its maximum takeoff capacity. Tibbets, by his own account in his memoir, Return of the Enola Gay, held the aircraft on the runway until the last possible moment before rotation, feeling the aircraft struggle to climb in the tropical darkness. 2 observation aircraft, carrying cameras and scientific instruments, had taken off minutes earlier. A 3rd escort aircraft, the Great Artist, carried instrumentation packages that would be released over the target simultaneously with the bomb. Straight Flush and Jabbit the 3, weather reconnaissance aircraft, had departed hours earlier to assess conditions over the 3 possible target cities. The mission was airborne by 3 in the morning, Tinian time. Hiroshima was roughly 1,500 miles to the northwest. The flight to the target area took approximately 6 hours. Parsons armed the bomb over the Pacific as planned, completing the procedure without incident at altitude. The weather report from Straight Flush came in over the target. Hiroshima was clear. The primary target was confirmed at approximately 8:15 in the morning, Hiroshima time, which was roughly the same hour that the first Marines had crossed the line of departure toward the White Beaches almost exactly a year before. The Enola Gay's bombardier, Major Thomas Ferriby, released Little Boy from 31,600 feet over Hiroshima's Aioi Bridge aiming point. The bomb fell for 43 seconds. It detonated at approximately 1,900 feet above the ground. In the airburst configuration that the Los Alamos designers had determined would maximize the area of destructive effect. The yield was later estimated at between 12 and 18 kilotons of TNT equivalent. Tibbets, banking the aircraft hard away from the blast point at the moment of release, described the shockwave hitting the aircraft as feeling like a burst of flak. He looked back and saw the cloud. In his own words, recorded in his post-mission debriefing, there was a mushroom cloud growing up, and it was a spectacular sight. It was a petrifying sight. I am not going to describe in detail what happened in Hiroshima in the minutes, hours, and days that followed the detonation, because the prescription in this script against describing violence exists for a reason, and because the human experience of the Hiroshima survivors, the hibakusha, has been documented in first-person accounts of such power and specificity that any secondary narration from this distance would only dilute it. What I want to say instead is this. The mission from Northfield on the 6th of August, 1945, was not the end of the story that began on Tinian's White Beaches 14 months earlier. It was not even, precisely, the end of the war. Japan did not surrender on the 6th of August. The Supreme War Council in Tokyo met and debated. The army faction argued that the weapon might have been a one-off, that Japan's ability to resist continued, that surrender remained unthinkable. The debate would continue for 3 more days, until the second mission from Tinian and the Soviet declaration of war against Japan on the 8th of August combined to create conditions under which the Emperor's decision to end the war could be made and could survive the institutional resistance arrayed against it. The second mission, the Nagasaki mission on the 9th of August 1945, departed Northfield under circumstances that were, in several operational respects, less well-ordered than the first. The primary target was Kokura, a city on the island of Kyushu that hosted a major military arsenal. The aircraft carrying the Fat Man plutonium implosion bomb, Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, experienced a fuel transfer pump failure before departure that left approximately 600 gallons of fuel in a tank that couldn't be drawn upon. Sweeney and his crew proceeded despite the problem, because the alternative, offloading the Fat Man and the delay that entailed, was unacceptable. Over Kokura, the city was obscured by smoke from the previous day's conventional bombing of Yahata nearby. Sweeney made 3 bomb runs over Kokura and could not achieve visual confirmation of the aiming point that the mission rules required. He turned south for the secondary target, Nagasaki. The Fat Man was released at 11 minutes past 11 in the morning, Nagasaki time. The yield was approximately 21 kilotons. The bomb detonated approximately 4,700 feet from the aiming point, displaced by cloud cover. A displacement that, because of Nagasaki's hilly terrain, limited the radius of maximum destruction compared to what would have occurred over a flat city. That detail, that the mountains of Nagasaki partially shielded some neighborhoods from the blast effect, appears in the technical analysis conducted after the war by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. I note it not as mitigation, but because precision matters when the facts are themselves the most powerful testimony. Japan's surrender was announced by Emperor Hirohito in a radio broadcast on the 15th of August, 1945. The first time most Japanese civilians had ever heard his voice, and formally signed on the 2nd of September aboard USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The men at Northfield on Tinian learned of the surrender through the same channels as everyone else in the Pacific Theater. Official announcement, radio broadcast, the spontaneous eruption of noise from 50,000 men who understood, in that moment, that they were not going to die in the invasion of the Japanese home island. Operation Downfall, the planned amphibious assault on Kyushu, scheduled for November of 1945, had projected American casualties ranging from 190,000 to over 1,000,000, depending on which analysis you trust and which assumptions you accept. Those projections were contested then and are contested by historians now. What is not contested is that the men who knew about Downfall, who knew that their bomb groups would be part of the softening campaign before the landings, and who had watched the casualty rates at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, believed those projections were real. The news of surrender on Northfield was not a complicated emotional event for most of the men who received it. I want to be direct about the moral dimension of what happened here, because documentary history that avoids moral directness is, in my view, not doing its full job. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed, by the best available estimates, between 120,000 and 220,000 people, the large majority of them civilians. The decision to use the weapons was made by people who believed it would end the war faster than the alternative of invasion. And there is a serious historical case that it did. There is also a serious historical case made by scholars including Gar Alperovitz and Tsuyoshi Hasegawa that the Soviet entry into the Pacific War on the 8th of August was at least as consequential for Japan's decision to surrender as the bombs themselves, and that the bombs may therefore not have been the decisive factor their use was predicated on. I'm not going to resolve that debate here, because it hasn't been resolved in the historical literature, and pretending otherwise would be exactly the kind of false tidiness that this series is supposed to resist. What I will say is that Tinian carried both things simultaneously: the extraordinary military and engineering achievement that made the mission possible, and the moral weight of what the mission was. That double burden is the island's permanent inheritance. Chapter 14, The Island That the War Left Behind. Tinian after surrender, 1945 to the present. The war ended on the 2nd of September, 1945, and the immediate consequence for Tinian was a kind of disassembly that moved almost as fast as the construction that had preceded it. Within weeks of the formal surrender ceremony aboard USS Missouri, the military rationale for maintaining 50,000 personnel on a small island in the Western Pacific evaporated. The bomb groups began standing down. The CB construction battalions received orders to prepare the infrastructure for either transfer or demolition. The supply ships that had been feeding the island's population at a rate of thousands of tons per week began redirecting their cargoes. The most elaborately built military base in the Pacific Theater, constructed in less than a year at extraordinary cost and effort, began the process of becoming surplus in a matter of months. If you're looking for an image that captures the speed at which the industrial logic of the Second World War could reverse direction, Tinian in the autumn of 1945 provides it. The demobilization of Tinian's military garrison followed the standard process of the Pacific Theater drawdown. Units were deactivated in reverse order of their arrival. Personnel were assigned priority ratings for return to the United States based on length of service and number of overseas campaigns. And equipment was either shipped west for the occupation of Japan, shipped east for storage in the continental United States, or, in the case of equipment deemed too expensive to move relative to its residual value, simply left. The construction equipment that the CBs had used to build Northfield, the bulldozers, graders, rock crushers, and dump trucks that had transformed a sugarcane island into the world's largest airfield complex, was, in significant quantities, pushed off the island's cliffs into the sea, because the shipping capacity required to move it home was more valuable than the equipment itself. That fact, bulldozers pushed off a cliff into the Pacific because it was cheaper than shipping them, is one of the more concise illustrations of the industrial scale at which the United States conducted the Pacific War. The civilian population of Tinian, the Japanese colonists, and Okinawan contract workers who had been in the Churo internment compound since the battle, began to be repatriated in the months following the surrender. Japanese nationals were returned to Japan under the repatriation program administered by the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. Okinawans were returned to Okinawa, which was by this point under American military occupation, and would remain so until 1972. The Chamorros, the indigenous people of the Mariana Islands, who had been removed from Tinian by the Japanese colonial administration years before the war, began the process of return that would eventually bring Chamorro communities back to the island, though the timeline and conditions of that return were shaped by the military occupation that outlasted the war by decades. The story of the Chamorros of Tinian is one that the standard military narrative of the battle essentially excludes, and that exclusion is a genuine historiographical problem. The island had indigenous inhabitants before it had sugarcane and before it had runways. Their history did not begin with the Japanese colonial period, and it did not end with the American military period. The Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, established in 1947 under United States administration and United Nations trusteeship, included the Mariana Islands. Tinian became part of a territory that was, for the following 3 decades, administered by the United States Navy, and then the Department of the Interior, with a degree of attention to local governance and economic development that the inhabitants of those islands consistently described as inadequate. The infrastructure of the Northfield complex, the runways, the roads, the Quonset hut foundations, remained on Tinian, slowly being absorbed by the vegetation or repurposed by the small civilian population that gradually returned. The bomb assembly buildings, the pit where the Enola Gay was loaded, the administrative buildings of the 509th compound. These survived, largely because they were concrete, and concrete is harder to demolish than it is to ignore. By the 1960s and 1970s, Tinian had reverted to a largely agricultural existence. The runways weeded and cracked, the military city reduced to foundations and memories. The Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, of which Tinian is a part, entered into a political union with the United States in 1978, granting its residents American citizenship and establishing a constitutional government. The economic development of Tinian in the decades since has been modest compared to neighboring Saipan, which became the administrative center of the Northern Marianas and the site of significant tourism and commercial development. Tinian has remained quieter. A cattle ranch of considerable acreage occupies much of the island's central plateau. A small casino hotel operated for a period and then closed. The population has stayed small, in the range of 2,000 to 4,000 in recent decades. The physical remnants of the Second World War, the runways, the bomb pits, The gun emplacements, the caves of the southern cliffs where Ogata's garrison made its last stand, are present everywhere on the island, embedded in the landscape, like the bones of something that hasn't quite finished becoming the past. Northfield is a National Historic Landmark today. The designation was applied in 1985, reflecting the site's significance to the atomic age. The bomb assembly buildings. Building 1, where Little Boy was prepared, and Building 2, where Fat Man was readied, are maintained by the Northern Marianas government as historical sites and are accessible to visitors. The loading pit where the Enola Gay's bomb was positioned for transfer to the aircraft is visible, concrete edging intact in the red laterite soil of the assembly compound. The runway designated Runway Able, the strip from which Enola Gay lifted off on the 6th of August 1945, is still visible as a strip of broken vegetation-studded coral running northwest to southeast across the island's plateau. Cattle graze at its edges. The control tower is gone. The Quonset huts are gone, but the geometry of the runway remains legible in the landscape. Japanese memorial sites on Tinian reflect the complexity of memorializing a battle from the perspective of the losing side. The Tinian Memorial, maintained by a Japanese organization and visited annually by groups of Japanese citizens, many of them descendants of soldiers or civilians killed on the island, is located in the island's south, near the cliffs where the final fighting occurred. It lists the names of Japanese military dead. A separate civilian memorial acknowledges of the Japanese and Okinawan civilians who died during the battle and its aftermath. Chamorro cultural advocates on the island have, in recent years, pushed for greater acknowledgement of the indigenous presence in the island's commemorative landscape. The recognition that the story of Tinian predates both the Japanese colonial period and the American military period, and that the island's full history includes people and experiences that the standard World War II narrative doesn't reach. The United States military returned to Tinian in the post-Cold War period in a different capacity, not as an occupying force, but as a leaseholder. The Military Use Agreement of 1983, signed between the United States Department of Defense and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, leased the northern third of Tinian, including the Northfield area, to the United States military for possible future use. The lease runs for 50 years with renewal options. Military development of the leased area has been intermittent and contested. Environmental impact studies, local political opposition, and competing assessments of strategic need have shaped a conversation about the island's military future that continues today. The most recent discussions, as of the time I last reviewed the relevant planning documents, involve proposals for training ranges and pre-positioning facilities associated with American strategic posture in the Western Pacific. The geography that made Tinian valuable in 1944 has not stopped being geography. I want to close this chapter with an observation about memory and place, because Tinian is, in a very specific way, a place where the relationship between physical landscape and historical memory is unusually direct. The bomb pit is still there. The runway is still there. The caves are still there. The cliffs where the Marines climbed are still there, weathered, overgrown, but identifiable to anyone who reads the battle maps carefully enough. Most of the battlefields of the Second World War have been absorbed by urban development, agricultural reclamation, or the simple passage of decades in heavily populated regions. Tinian, because it remained sparsely populated after the war, has preserved its physical record in ways that the beaches of Normandy or the streets of Stalingrad cannot. That physical preservation is both a gift to the historian and a reminder that the island is not yet done being used. By memory, by strategic planning, by the long argument between nations about what the Pacific means, and who has claims upon it. Chapter 15. What the Island Asks, Legacy, Moral, Weight, and the Long Shadow of Northfield. I've been sitting with this chapter for a while, because ending a documentary about Tinian involves a set of obligations that are harder to meet than any of the tactical chapters. The tactical chapters ask for accuracy and precision, and a willingness to sit with uncomfortable facts. This chapter asks for something more. A willingness to engage honestly with what this island's history means, without either glorifying the violence that shaped it or pretending that the violence was separable from the outcomes it produced. Those two requirements pull in opposite directions, and navigating between them is, I think, the central challenge of any serious engagement with Tinian's legacy. Let me start with the question of what Tinian's battle cost in the fullest accounting. On the American side, 328 killed, 1,571 wounded in the 9 days of the battle itself. Additional casualties in the mopping up phase that are not fully consolidated in the primary sources. The men killed in the preparation, on the Colorado, on the Norman Scott, in the reconnaissance boats in the Saipan Channel. The Seabees killed in construction accidents during the transformation of the island. The air crews lost in the B-29 campaign, flown from the runways they died to build. On the Japanese side, approximately 5,400 military dead, 252 prisoners, and a number of civilian dead that the historical record cannot specify with confidence because the conditions of the Southern Cliff fighting and the chaos of the final days made comprehensive accounting impossible. Every one of those numbers is a person. Every person had a name. The asymmetry between the care with which the American dead are named and counted in the historical record and the relative anonymity of the Japanese dead, military and civilian, is a function of who controls the archives. And it's a function I find myself noticing with increasing discomfort the longer I work with this material. The question of whether the Battle of Tinian was necessary is not quite the right question to ask, because necessary implies that the outcome, the end of the Pacific War, was the only possible outcome of the path that produced it. And that's a counterfactual argument that no evidence can definitively resolve. The more useful question is whether the specific decisions made about Tinian, the decision to seize the Marianas, the decision to develop the island as a B-29 base, the decision to use it as the launch point for the atomic missions, were made with adequate consideration of what they would produce. The answer to that question varies depending on which decision you're examining. The decision to seize the Marianas was made before the atomic bomb was a certainty. It was made on the logic of conventional strategic bombing, and that logic was sound within the framework of how the Pacific War was being conducted. The decision to use the atomic weapons from Tinian was made with full knowledge, at the highest levels of the American command, of what those weapons would do to cities and their populations. Whether that knowledge was accompanied by adequate moral deliberation is a question that the historical record does not answer cleanly, and historians are still arguing about it. The historiographical debate about the atomic bombings is the most contested topic in the entire literature of the Second World War, and I want to be honest about the state of that debate, rather than resolving it artificially for the purpose of a clean conclusion. The traditionalist view, articulated most influentially by Henry Stimson in his famous 1947 Harper's article, and maintained in various forms by historians, including Robert James Maddox and D.M. Jan Greco, holds that the bombs were used to end the war quickly, avoided a land invasion of Japan that would have cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides, and were therefore justified within the utilitarian calculus of wartime decision-making. The revisionist view, developed by Gar Alperovitz from the 1960s onward, and extended by Tsuyoshi Hasegawa's research into Japanese and Soviet archives, argues that Japan was already seeking a way to end the war before the bombs were dropped. That Soviet entry into the Pacific War on the 8th of August was at least as important as the bombs in precipitating the surrender, and that the decision to use the weapons was influenced by post-war geopolitical considerations, specifically demonstrating American nuclear capability to the Soviet Union, as much as by military necessity. Both positions have serious scholarly support. Neither has been definitively settled. I'm not going to settle it here, but I think it matters that viewers of a documentary about Tinian know it's unsettled. The experience of the Hibakusha, the survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, is documented in a body of testimony that has no equivalent in any other episode of the Second World War, in terms of the specificity of the human experience it preserves. The testimonies collected by the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, by the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum, by researchers including Robert J. Lifton in his 1967 study, Death in Life, and by journalists including John Hersey in his 1946 report, Hiroshima, which was the entire August 31st issue of The New Yorker, constitute one of the most extensive records of the immediate and long-term human consequences of a specific military action that exists in the historical literature. I am not going to reproduce those testimonies here, because they don't need me as an intermediary, and because this is a documentary about Tinian, not primarily about Hiroshima. But anyone who engages seriously with the Battle of Tinian, without also engaging seriously with those testimonies, has not finished the research. The runway and the bomb pit are part of the same history as the testimonies of the people who survived what was dropped from them. The post-war career of Northfield raises questions about the long-term relationship between military infrastructure and the communities that host it. Questions that are not unique to Tinian, but are unusually vivid there. The military use agreement that leases the northern third of the island to the United States Department of Defense was negotiated between the American federal government and the Northern Marianas government. But the people who live on Tinian, whose cattle range on the land adjacent to the leased area, whose children grow up within sight of the broken runways and the bomb pit landmarks, had a more limited voice in those negotiations than the legal frameworks involved might suggest. The politics of American military basing in the Pacific Islands is a topic that deserves more attention from the kind of audience that watches long-form documentaries about the Second World War, because the strategic decisions of 1944 have administrative and physical consequences in the islands, affected by them that extend into the present day. Tinian is not a museum. It's a place where people live, and the military history that defines its international profile is not always the same history that defines the daily experience of its residents. The question of how Tinian should be remembered, or rather, remembered by whom and for what purpose, is one that the island's various memorial sites reflect in their different emphases. The American memorials commemorate the Marines and soldiers who died in the assault. The Japanese memorials commemorate the soldiers and civilians who died defending or surviving on the island. The Chamorro cultural perspective, the indigenous voice in a story usually told by the colonizers who succeeded each other on this particular piece of land, is the one most frequently absent from the standard commemorative landscape. And its absence is more than a gap in representation. It's a reminder that the narrative of World War II in the Pacific has, in the popular telling, tended to be a story about two great powers in conflict, with the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Islands present mainly as terrain. The Chamorro people of the Marianas were occupied by Spain, then Germany, then Japan, then the United States. Their experience of the battle caught between two foreign military forces on land that was legally administered by one foreign power and about to be seized by another, is documented in memoirs, oral histories, and local historical research that deserves a place in this story and hasn't always received one. I want to return, as this chapter moves toward its close, to the physical reality of Tinian as it exists today, because I think the island itself makes an argument that no amount of narration can quite replicate. You can walk the runway. You can stand at the edge of the bomb pit. You can follow the road from the assembly buildings to the taxiway, along which the Enola Gay moved toward the runway in the pre-dawn darkness of the 6th of August, 1945. You can drive south to the cliffs where the last fighting happened, where the Japanese garrison made its final stand, and where the caves are still visible in the limestone. Open now, empty, the vegetation growing back across the cliff faces. You can find the beach at White Beach too if you know where to look. A small sandy break in the limestone cliffs that is, today, so nondescript that you'd drive past it without a second thought if you didn't know what it was. The beach is no wider now than it was in July 1944. The cliffs are the same height, the water is the same colour, and yet everything that followed from the choice to land there, everything described in the 12 chapters that preceded this one, started at that small gap in a limestone cliff on the north coast of a small island that most people in the world have never heard of. The Battle of Tinian lasted 9 days. The construction of Northfield took 9 months. The atomic missions lasted a matter of hours. The consequences of all three are still being measured and argued over and lived with more than 80 years later. That is what makes Tinian different from other battlefields. Not just the scale of what happened here, but the reach of it. The decisions made on this island, or enabled by the seizure of this island, or launched from the runways built on this island, shaped the world in which we live. The nuclear deterrence frameworks, the Cold War architecture, the post-war international order constructed in the knowledge that 2 Japanese cities had been destroyed by single bombs. None of that was visible from the White Beaches on the morning of the 24th of July, 1944. None of it was in the orders carried by the Marines of the 4th Division as they crossed the line of departure at 0717. They were doing their job in the specific circumstances of their moment, as well as they knew how. That is true of almost every person in this story, on every side of it, and it doesn't resolve the moral weight of what the story produced. It just reminds you that history is made by people who can't see around the corner they're standing at. I think that's all I can offer about Tinian that the evidence warrants. Not a verdict, not a clean conclusion, just the record, as precisely as I can assemble it, of what happened on a flat island in the Western Pacific in the summer of 1944 and the year that followed it. The island is still there. The bomb pit is still there. The beach is still there. Go if you can. The place itself will tell you things that I can't. Chapter 16. The architects of the operation, the commanders, the planners, and their post-war lives. The men who planned and commanded the Battle of Tinian did not, for the most part, sit still after it. The Pacific War had more battles to fight, and the officers who had demonstrated competence on Tinian were immediately recycled into the operations that followed. But I want to spend a chapter with them, with who they were, how they made their decisions, and what happened to them afterward. Because the biographical dimension of military history is one that the operational narrative tends to flatten, and the people involved in this operation were individually more interesting and more complicated than their ranks and titles suggest. Holland McTire Smith, Howlin' Mad, retired from the Marine Corps in May of 1946 as a full general, the highest rank the Corps offered. His post-war memoir, Coral and Brass, published in 1949, was immediately controversial for its sharp criticism of Army commanders, particularly Major General Ralph Smith of the Army's 27th Infantry Division, whose relief during the Saipan operation by Holland and Smith had created an inter-service dispute that never fully healed. The nickname Howlin' Mad was not, by most accounts of people who served under him, entirely ironic. He was genuinely and frequently volcanic in his professional manner. But the men who served under him also, consistently, respected his tactical judgment, his insistence on the White Beach plan for Tinian, his willingness to fight Turner through conference after conference and take the argument all the way up the chain of command, if necessary, was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential tactical judgments of the Pacific Campaign. He died in January of 1967 at the age of 76 in San Diego. Richmond Kelly Turner, Terrible Turner, had a post-war career that his wartime reputation might not have predicted. He retired from the Navy in 1947 as a full admiral, and in his later years, he was recognized as one of the principal architects of American Amphibious doctrine, the body of tactical and logistical knowledge that had made operations like Tinian possible. His initial resistance to the White Beach plan is well documented. What's less well documented, but worth noting, is that Turner ultimately supported the plan once the reconnaissance data was in hand, and that his concerns about beach width and supply throughput were not professionally unfounded. The White Beaches did create genuine supply bottlenecks in the first days after the landing. The logistics operation worked, but it was harder than the plan's advocates had projected. Turner died in February of 1961. His papers at the Library of Congress contain a substantial correspondence about the planning disputes for both Saipan and Tinian that repays careful reading. Major General Harry Schmidt, who commanded the Northern Troops and Landing Force on Tinian, and whose vote for the White Beach Plan helped tip the conference against Turner, commanded the 5th Amphibious Corps through the Battle of Iwo Jima in February and March of 1945, a battle that would cost more than 6,800 Marines killed and nearly 19,000 wounded in 36 days of fighting on an island smaller than Tinian. The contrast between Iwo Jima and Tinian, in terrain, in Japanese defensive preparation, in the cost to the attackers, is itself a significant historical observation. On Tinian, the planning was near perfect, and the execution matched it. On Iwo Jima, the planning was professional, but the terrain and the extraordinary depth of the Japanese defensive preparation made losses unavoidable regardless of tactical decisions. Schmidt retired after the war and died in 1980. The after-action report he submitted for Tinian is one of the most detailed and analytically honest operational documents in the Marine Corps' Pacific War Archive. Colonel Paul Tibbets, the pilot of Enola Gay, lived with the consequences of the 6th of August, 1945 for the remaining 62 years of his life, until his death in November 2007. He never publicly expressed regret for the mission, a position he maintained consistently across decades of interviews, public appearances, and one extended oral history, and which he restated in a 2002 interview with Studs Terkel. I knew when I got the assignment it was going to be an emotional thing. We had feelings, but we had to put them in the background. He requested that there be no funeral and no tombstone, specifically to prevent his grave from becoming a site of protest or demonstration. His ashes were scattered over the English Channel, as he had requested. Tibbets's consistency on the question of whether the mission was justified is itself a historical data point, not because it resolves the moral, but because it represents one honest account of what it meant to be the person who flew that aircraft on that morning and chose thereafter to stand by what he had done. Captain William Parsons, the bomb commander who armed Little Boy in flight, and who oversaw the weapons assembly program on Tinian, went on to have a significant post-war career in the emerging field of nuclear weapons policy and management. He rose to the rank of Rear Admiral and served as one of the principal military liaisons between the Atomic Energy Commission and the armed forces in the period of nuclear weapons development immediately following the war. He died in December of 1953 at the age of 52, before the full implications of the nuclear age he had helped create had worked themselves out into the strategic and political frameworks of the Cold War. The correspondence between Parsons and Robert Oppenheimer during the months of preparation for the Tinian operations, available in the Los Alamos National Laboratory archives, reveals a working relationship between a naval ordnance officer and a theoretical physicist that was, by the testimony of both men, genuinely collaborative and mutually respectful. That's worth noting in a period when civil-military relationships around nuclear weapons were frequently characterized by mutual incomprehension. Major James Jones, the reconnaissance battalion commander whose unit had scouted the White Beaches and made the entire White Beach plan possible, continued to serve in the Marine Corps after the war and rose to the rank of general. He is perhaps better known to history through his son, General James L. Jones Jr., who served as Supreme Allied Commander Europe, Commandant of the Marine Corps, and National Security Advisor to President Barack Obama. The generational continuity of military service represented in that family tree is not unusual in American military history, but the specific connection between the father's rubber boat in the water off Tinian's north coast in July 1944 and the son's career at the highest levels of American strategic leadership nearly 6 decades later is a thread I find genuinely striking. The reconnaissance that made the Battle of Tinian possible was conducted by a man whose family's service continues to shape American military history. That's not a minor biographical footnote. It's a reminder of how specific individual actions in specific moments propagate through time in ways that no one conducting those actions could possibly anticipate. The Japanese commanders of the Tinian defense, Colonel Ogata and Captain Oi, died on the island, as noted in an earlier chapter, and left no post-war record. Their perspective on the battle's planning and execution is available only through the interrogations of the few surviving officers taken prisoner, principally Major Yoshida's account in the V. Amphibious Corps intelligence report, and through the formal after-action analysis conducted by American intelligence officers reviewing captured Japanese documents. Ogata's standing orders, the directive that each battalion would execute its own counterattack independently, appear in the captured document record. His reasoning for placing minimal forces at the northern beaches appears in the pre-battle operational orders. What doesn't appear anywhere in the surviving record is his experience of the battle as it unfolded. The moment he understood that the feint had worked, and the landing was in the north, the decisions he made in the days that followed as his communication network collapsed and his forces were ground down one position at a time. That interior record, if it was ever kept, didn't survive. We have the outline of what Ogata did. We don't have his account of why, beyond the formal operational logic that the documents record. That gap is, I think, one of the genuine limitations of working with this particular battle. And I want to acknowledge it, rather than pretend the record is more complete than it is. The legacy of the commanders of Tinian, American and Japanese, raises a question that I find increasingly central to my own engagement with Pacific War history. How do we evaluate the decisions of military commanders within a moral framework that has continued to evolve since those decisions were made? The standards by which we judge the targeting of civilian areas, the conduct of siege operations, the use of weapons of mass destruction, These have shifted considerably between 1944 and today as international humanitarian law has developed, as the experiences of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and later nuclear near misses have shaped global consciousness about what nuclear weapons mean, and as post-colonial scholarship has given voice to the experiences of the Pacific Islanders, whose lands were used as the terrain of other people's conflicts. I don't think the commanders of Tinian should be evaluated by standards they had no way of knowing would apply. But I do think that evaluating them only by the standards of their own moment is an insufficient response to the full complexity of what they did and what it produced. The honest position, as best I can hold it, is that these were human beings making decisions under conditions of genuine uncertainty, with the information and frameworks available to them in 1944, and that both the decisions and their consequences deserve rigorous examination, not condemnation, not absolution, but examination. Chapter 17, The Weapons That Flew from Tinian, the B-29 and the Strategic Bombing Campaign. The B-29 Super Fortress is the aircraft that Tinian was built to fly, and I want to spend a full chapter on it, not on its technical specifications in isolation, but on what it meant to design, build, operate, and survive as a crew member of the most complex and demanding combat aircraft of the Second World War. The bomber doesn't get the popular attention that the P-51 Mustang or the B-17 Flying Fortress does, partly because its primary operational theatre was the Pacific rather than Europe, and partly because its most famous missions, the atomic flights, are so historically weighty that they tend to overwhelm the story of the conventional bombing campaign that preceded them and continued alongside them. But the B-29 campaign from the Marianas was, in the scale of destruction it produced over Japan, without parallel in the European theatre. Understanding what flew from Tinian's runways requires understanding the aircraft that flew it and the men who flew it. The Boeing B-29 was the product of a design competition launched in early 1940, before the United States was at war, for a hemispheric defense bomber capable of very long ranges. The original requirement called for a 4-engine aircraft with a range of 5,000 miles, a top speed of 400 miles per hour, and a bomb load of 2,000 pounds. As the design evolved and requirements grew, those figures changed dramatically. The production B-29 that flew from Tinian had a maximum range of roughly 5,500 miles, though typical combat missions were considerably shorter. A cruise speed of approximately 220 miles per hour at altitude, a service ceiling of 33,000 feet, and a bomb capacity of up to 20,000 pounds in its standard configuration. It was pressurized, meaning the crew could operate in shirt-sleeve comfort at high altitude without oxygen masks, a revolutionary capability in combat aircraft of the period. It had a remote-controlled defensive armament system with fire-control computers managing multiple gun turrets, a system so complex that it was prone to malfunctions that cost crews their lives. It required approximately 11 men to operate in combat: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, flight engineer, radio operator, radar operator, and 4 gunners. The B-29 program was among the most expensive single weapons development efforts of the Second World War, more expensive, in dollar terms, than the Manhattan Project. It was also, by the standards of 1942 and early 1943, when production was being ramped up, dangerously prone to engine fires. The Wright R3 350 Cyclone engines that powered the production aircraft ran hotter than the airframe design tolerances in the nacelle. The engine housings were built to accommodate, and the early modification program to address this problem was conducted while aircraft were already in the field and missions were already being flown. Engine fires were the most common cause of non-combat B-29 losses throughout the campaign, and the records of the 20th Air Force from the Marianas bases document engine fire incidents with a frequency that explains why crews sometimes described the aircraft with language that combined respect for its capability with genuine unease about its reliability. Several veterans recorded their experience of watching a nacelle catch fire at altitude over the Pacific as one of the most frightening moments of their service, distinct in character from combat fear because the threat was coming from the aircraft itself rather than from the enemy. The B-29 campaign from the Marianas underwent a fundamental change in strategy in March of 1945. And that change is inseparable from the story of Tinian because it shaped what Tinian's runways were actually used to do in the last 6 months of the war. The original strategic bombing doctrine applied to Japan, high-altitude precision daylight bombing of industrial targets, the same doctrine the 8th Air Force had been applying in Europe, was producing disappointing results. Japan's dispersed industrial production, the cloud cover over the islands for much of the winter months, the extreme altitude required for B-29 operations that reduced bombing accuracy, and the durability of Japanese industry in weathering precision attacks all contributed to a program that wasn't achieving its objectives. General Curtis LeMay, who took command of the 21st Bomber Command in January of 1945, reconceived the campaign from its foundations. He would strip the aircraft of defensive armament and extra crew weight, load them with incendiary bombs rather than high explosives, fly them at night at low altitude, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, and burn Japanese cities rather than surgically destroy their industries. The first major implementation of LeMay's new doctrine was the raid on Tokyo on the night of the 9th into the 10th of March, 1945, Operation Meeting House. 334 B-29s lifted off from the Marianas bases in a period of roughly 3 hours, flying at low altitude over Tokyo in the early morning hours, dropping incendiary clusters into a city largely constructed of wood. They created a firestorm. The exact number of people killed in that single night is estimated by Japanese and American sources in a range from 80,000 to 100,000, making it the most destructive conventional air raid in history, more destructive in immediate human casualties than either atomic bombing. 16 square miles of Tokyo were burned. A significant fraction of the aircraft that flew the mission departed from North Field on Tinian. I want to be precise about the moral geography of this fact. The atomic bombings are remembered because they are categorically unique. The March 10th Tokyo raid is less remembered in the popular consciousness, but by any measure of immediate human cost, it was comparable to, and in some estimates, exceeded the human cost of either atomic bomb. The distinction between the conventional firebombing campaign and the atomic missions is important technologically and strategically. Whether it is as significant morally as the popular narrative suggests is a question that the historians of strategic bombing have been working on since the 1960s, and one that I think deserves honest acknowledgement in any account of what Tinian was used for. The B-29 crews who flew the Marianas campaign are a population that has, in recent decades, aged out of living memory. The youngest man who flew a combat mission from Tinian in the summer of 1945 would be in his late 90s today. Their oral histories, collected by the National Museum of the Pacific War, the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, and a number of veterans organizations, are among the most detailed first-person accounts of long-range strategic bombing operations that exist. They describe missions that lasted 14 to 16 hours, much of that time over ocean, with no landmarks and limited navigation aids. They describe the cold at altitude, Even in a pressurized cabin, the temperatures at cruise altitude over the Pacific in winter were punishing if any system failed. They described the tension of the outbound leg, the controlled focus of the bomb run, and the specific quality of relief on the homebound leg, when it was clear the aircraft would make it back. They also describe, in accounts that sometimes took decades to emerge publicly, the things they saw on the bomb runs, the fires below, the scale of the destruction visible even from altitude, the knowledge of what the incendiary loads did to wooden cities. That knowledge, carried home by the survivors of these crews, is part of the full human record of the Tinian campaign and deserves to sit alongside the tactical and strategic narrative. The strategic assessment of the B-29 bombing campaign from the Marianas, conducted primarily by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which deployed hundreds of analysts to Japan immediately after the surrender, produced a body of evidence about the effects of strategic bombing on Japan's war economy and civilian morale that has been used and contested by historians ever since. The survey's conclusions included the finding that Japan's ability to continue the war was being severely degraded by the bombing campaign, that her oil supply was nearly exhausted, and that even without the atomic bombs or an invasion, Japan might have surrendered by the end of 1945. That finding has been used by the revisionist historians as evidence that the atomic bombings weren't necessary to end the war. The traditionalist historians respond that might have is not a standard of proof sufficient to support the decision-making of commanders acting in real time under genuine uncertainty. Both arguments cite the same survey. That's a useful reminder of how the same body of evidence can support contradictory conclusions when the underlying question is moral rather than empirical. Chapter 18. The Island as Mirror. Tinian and the questions it still asks us. We come at last to the chapter I've been building toward for this entire documentary, and I want to begin it with something personal, because I think that's what this kind of history requires at the end. I've spent more time with Tinian than I've spent with almost any other single location in the Pacific War. And the thing that keeps bringing me back is not the military history, exactly. It's the way the island functions as a mirror, a surface that reflects the assumptions you bring to it, rather than simply confirming them. If you come to Tinian looking for a story about American heroism and strategic brilliance, you'll find it. If you come looking for a story about the moral catastrophe of industrial warfare, you'll find that too. If you come looking for a story about the indigenous people of the Marianas, caught between successive colonial powers, or the Japanese civilians who died in sugarcane fields, trying to understand what was happening to their world, or the Okinawan laborers who were brought to the island to work in the cane and found themselves inside a battle they had no part in starting, you'll find all of those stories too, though you'll have to look harder for them. In the standard literature, the island contains all of it simultaneously. The question is what you're willing to see. The historiography of Tinian is uneven in ways that reflect the broader unevenness of Pacific War scholarship. The American operational history is extremely well documented. The Marine Corps Historical Program produced detailed monographs on both the planning and the execution of the operation. The after-action reports of the units involved are available at the National Archives. The administrative records of the construction program and the 509th Composite Group have been systematically declassified over the decades since the war. The Japanese side is less well documented in English language sources, not because the documentation doesn't exist. The Japanese defense planning documents that survived the battle were translated and analyzed by American intelligence, but because the post-war Japanese historiography of the Pacific War has been shaped by cultural and political pressures that have made open engagement with specific military actions more complicated in Japan than the equivalent engagement has been in the United States. The Okinawan and Chamorro experiences on Tinian are the least documented of all, and that imbalance should trouble anyone who takes seriously the idea that historical completeness matters. One question that the island asks, and that I want to engage with directly, is the question of proportionality. The concept of proportionality in warfare, the idea that the harm caused by a military action should not be excessive relative to the military advantage gained, has a long history in the theory of just war and a specific legal history in the development of international humanitarian law. The Battle of Tinian, evaluated by the standards of military necessity and proportionality, was not an unusually bloody campaign by Pacific War standards. The ratio of attackers' casualties to defenders' casualties was, by historic measures of offensive operations, favorable to the Americans. The civilian casualties, while real and serious, were a fraction of the civilian casualties in the conventional bombing campaign and the atomic missions that followed. But the proportionality question becomes more complex when you extend the frame of reference beyond the battle itself to include what the battle enabled. The construction of North Field and the missions it supported killed, in conservative estimates, somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 Japanese civilians in the months between November 1944 and August 1945. The question of whether those deaths, distributed across dozens of cities and raids, and a full atomic attack, are morally connected to the decision to seize Tinian is a genuine philosophical question, and not a simple one. The concept of military necessity, the legal and ethical doctrine that allows harm to civilians when it is genuinely unavoidable in the pursuit of legitimate military objectives, was used throughout the Pacific War to justify actions that later generations have found difficult to defend. The firebombing of Tokyo, the systematic destruction of Japanese cities, the atomic bombings, all were justified by their proponents on the grounds of military necessity, specifically the argument that they would shorten the war and thereby reduce total casualties on both sides. Whether that argument was true, whether the war was actually shortened by these actions by enough to justify their cost, is the empirical question at the heart of the moral debate. And as I noted in an earlier chapter, it is genuinely unresolved. What I want to note here is that the framing of military necessity has, in every period, tended to be set by those who have the military capability to cause the harm in question. The people who bear the harm don't generally get to determine what counts as necessary. That asymmetry is not unique to the Second World War, but it is visible with unusual clarity at Tinian, where the physical infrastructure of the harm and the documentation of both the decision-making and the human consequences are preserved in unusually complete form. The nuclear legacy of Tinian extends far beyond the two missions of August 1945. The institutional knowledge developed in the 509th Composite Group, the procedures for transporting, assembling, arming, and delivering nuclear weapons, became the foundation of the American nuclear weapons delivery program in the early Cold War period. The Air Force's Strategic Air Command, established in March of 1946 under General George Kenney, and reorganized under General Curtis LeMay in 1948, drew directly on the operational experience of the Marianas B-29 campaign and the 509th specific procedures. LeMay, who had commanded the incendiary bombing campaign from the Marianas, and who understood the B-29's operational envelope better than almost any other officer in the Air Force, shaped the early SAC into an organization modeled on the 21st Bomber Command's operational culture. Rigid standardization, unrelenting emphasis on accuracy and reliability. Command authority concentrated at the top. The culture of American nuclear deterrence in the 1950s and 60s has its roots in part in the operational experience accumulated on and above the runways of Tinian. The arms control frameworks that eventually placed limits on the nuclear arsenals that grew from the Tinian legacy. The Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, the various strategic arms limitation agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union through the 1970s and 80s were products of a world that had been shaped by the experience of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Hibakusha testified before international bodies, wrote memoirs, and bore physical witness to what nuclear weapons did in a way that made the abstraction of deterrence theory impossible to sustain without acknowledgement of the human reality it rested on. The international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, which received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017, traces its intellectual lineage directly to the testimony of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors. That lineage runs from those survivors back through the missions of August 1945, back through the construction of Northfield, back through the Battle of Tinian, back through a planning conference on the Rocky Mount, where two American officers argued about the width of a beach. History is long and its connections are serious. I want to close this documentary where it began, with the geography. The white beaches are still there. They're not marked with any particular prominence. The cliffs above them are the same limestone, the same irregular faces, with the same small trees growing from the crevices where Marine infantrymen scrambled up in the pre-dawn darkness of July the 24th, 1944. The beach below is perhaps 20 yards wide at low tide, narrow enough that you could throw a stone across it with ease, small enough that you'd dismiss it as a landing site in an instant. And yet, more than 15,000 men came through here in a single day. And what they set